Tejaswini will start the meeting.
Yes, ma'am.
So good morning to everyone who's logged in for this webinar on ethics in research, which is an online training program and a certification. So we are trying to look at what are involved with ethics in research. I know most of us are a part of the ethics committee and the scientific committee members. So it's very important for us to know what are the rules and regulations of ethics in research. So the few topics which I've looked into is the basic topics, the new drugs clinical trials and rules of 2019, the ICMR guidelines, the ICH and the good clinical practice guidelines, the ethics committee overview. How do you evaluate your, because I know when we are a member, we do get the research protocol. So we should be knowing what we are, as a member of the committee, we should know what we are supposed to look into the study and what suggestions, because we have a responsibility on the society and so as we are a part of the ethics in clinical trials. And we do have our eminent speakers here for this meeting. We have Dr. Prasanna Ganapathy, who's a head in global clinical strategy and innovation at Viatris, Dr. Surinder Kher, who's an advisor for BioQuest Solutions and executive head of clinical research at Aster Hospital, and Dr. Animesh Jain, professor in community medicine, Kasturba Medical College, Bangalore. So without wasting much time, I hope we do, and of course, if anybody has any, because I know some of them are legal aspects, legal member, lay person. So if you think you have any queries regarding the same as what you are supposed to look into your protocol when it comes to you, please do put it in the chat box for the speakers so that they can answer your queries. So our first speaker for today is Dr. Prasanna Ganapathy. We have topics lined up. It's Dr. Prasanna Ganapathy. So he's a physician working in clinical research for the past 18 years and very passionate about designing efficient and ethical clinical studies. And at present, he's serving as a head of global clinical strategy and innovation at Viatris. And he has previously associated with Biocon and Dr. Reddy's with the 15 years of industry experience, and is graduated from Bangalore Medical College, Bangalore, and MD Pharmac from Christian Medical College, Vellore. So he's going to start the first topic on ethics overview, ICH and GCP guidelines. Over to you, Dr. Prasanna.
Thanks, Dr. Maneja. Thanks for the opportunity, and hello everyone. Good morning. Am I audible well? Otherwise,
yes. I think little bit more. It's little feeble. Yeah. Otherwise, you're audible.
Okay, so then I'll switch on to my earphones so that may be better. Okay. Is this better? Any better?
It's better.
It's better. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the opportunity. So can I share the screen? I think I should be. Yeah.
You have to make it full screen. Yeah. Yeah. Fine.
Okay, so this may be better.
Yes.
Okay, sure. I'm getting some background. Just maybe I'll go without my video. Okay. Okay, so Dr. Raju asked me to present on ethics overview. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Dr. Raju asked me to present on ethics overview and GCP today. The ICH 6 the Sec R2 revision, but I'll be covering overall GCP. So I thought it was just a presentation to our ethics committee, but I do realize that there are many more participants. So I thought of focus mostly as responsibilities of the ethics committee members, but feel free to ask any question. Again, I'm not an expert in this field, but I've been involved in clinical research for quite some time, and there are many instances where ethics as an issue did come up. So I'll be happy to share any such specific instances, or if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. So before starting, the disclaimer is the views what we discussed today will be mine and do not necessarily represent position of Viatris, where I'm an employee. We are involved in drug development globally, and we do conduct a lot of clinical trials. So that's kind of conflict of interest, but I don't think it would directly relate to anything we discussed today. And I do serve on 2 ethics committees as basic medical scientist. One is Shankar Eye Institute. I just, in the interest of time, I would be covering very briefly some of the topics, or maybe a brief overview of ethics in clinical research initially, and then an introduction to ICH-GCP. Because as I said, I was thinking it would be more for ethics committee members, and ICH-GCP is very vast. It has responsibilities, composition of multiple stakeholders. So what I was planning to do was focus on IRB responsibilities in the ICH-GCP, but happy to discuss anything else which is there in the GCP. And also there's a revision coming up. It is currently in draft, and we expect the first part of it to become adopted sometime in 2024. So, but maybe it's a good time to have a discussion on that. It will be a brief summary what I plan to do. Okay, let me start with the clinical research, the definition. So scientific research, as we know, that there are several different research activities which happen across, and this usually defined as a systemic collection of information to produce generalizable findings. And clinical research is a subset of scientific research, and it is a systematic collection of information from humans and or from organic material taken from humans to produce generalizable findings. And ethics is relevant both like overall scientific research. You might have heard the animal ethics and others, but it becomes much more critical when it comes to clinical research. And there's a reason behind it, there's a history behind it, why it is so critical. And I'm sure many of you might be practicing physicians. So it is important to understand there's a clear distinction between clinical research and clinical medicine, though it was first discussed, I think, in Belmont report. So, but it is important to understand at a concept level. When you are practicing clinical medicine, there's already a risk benefit which you have thought about. That there is a benefit, and the intent is to benefit the patient, and you as a physician understand the risks and you communicate the risks to the patient. And there's an established risk benefit analysis which will help you make such decisions among different options. So the ethics involved in clinical medicine are slightly different. But when you come to clinical research, the benefit is not given. There is an equipoise, and it is, and the risks obviously are associated. Some are known, some are unknown. So here, technically, the risk benefit is not so much in favor of the subject. So that is where the ethics becomes very important, and the autonomy of the subject to participate in such a research activity also becomes very important. So the ethics of clinical research and clinical medicine are slightly different. And another important concept here is you cannot separate ethics from the scientific aspect of the study. Both are very highly intertwined. It is, and that you see in most of the guidelines as well. Many times I've been there on many ethics committee meetings. So as an investigator, as a sponsor, and also as a member. Sometimes we make this effort to separate ethics, the question of ethics, from the scientific aspects. And it happens sometimes because most of the organizations will also have a separate scientific committee and an ethics committee. That is very important, and it makes sense. It is also important to see the science behind a planned study in more detail. So the scientific committees will help in that aspect. But then when it comes to ethics committees, it is also important to combine both and understand the impact of such a scientific question, and also the ethics around it. You just cannot separate them out and see. You just cannot say ignore the overall study, but only talk about the how the ethical components are getting affected. So it's basically both are together, and that's how most of the guidelines have been written as well. It is like, I'm not saying every member should understand every finer aspect of the study or research question, but at least they should be able to understand whether it is needed or not, whether it is in the interest of the society, interest of the subject. So that is something which should always be discussed. So, for example, there's this famous example people give us where a researcher is excited that he was able to successfully transplant an appendix. So, but at least a committee member should be in a position to ask whether it is necessary. So that is that kind of scientific understanding of the need of such a study for the society, for science, that should be understood. The design, whether it is, if there's any better design, if there's a better design which would reduce the risks to the participants or improve the benefits coming out of the study. So that is something at a very top level the members should understand. So that is another concept where you cannot separate ethics and science in these kind of discussions. So let us go into clinical research ethics. Much of the ethics which we talk is something which focuses on ought of what has to be done in a specific set of circumstances. So when I say ought, it is something like what should be done. It is when a given circumstances are there, and the correctness. It is more of what is the right thing to do. And similarly, the clinical research ethics focuses on what ought to be done in research involving human participants. So that's the clinical research ethics at a very top level. And each study component has an ethical aspect. The ethical aspects, which we just discussed, that you just cannot separate them out in a clinical trial from the scientific objectives. They should go together. So that is that's an important concept we should remember, because that's the basis of most of the guidelines. So origins of oversight, I'm sure most of you would have already attended or read through different clinical trial ethics and how this evolved over time and the different events which led to these regulations, guidelines. So that though the Nazi experiments during the World War II, though they were not the first harmful research, because there was already elixir tragedy was there before. There are many experiments were happening before, and the idea of consent was not there. It was not just in Germany, but it was across the world. That concept was still not developed well. But what really happened during Nazi, why we keep referring to that, is because this was unprecedented in the scope and the degree of harm suffering which human beings had to go through during these experiments. And make no mistake, there were some really important scientific questions were there in these experiments. The science took over the interest of the subjects who are participating, and there was really no concept of consent, autonomy to the patients. And they were performed on thousands of concentration camp prisoners, which is the vulnerable population. And there were some really deadly studies. There were toxins were injected to the patients. The natural history of the disease was evaluated by infecting the patients. There are many such things which were today we can't even think of something like that. So in 1946, they went to trial, and many of them got indicted. Many of the senior members of the German medical associations got indicted before the War Crimes Tribunal. And that report came as Nuremberg Code, because it happened in Nuremberg in 1947. So there, in the whole report, there is a small section called permissible medical experiments, and that came out as Nuremberg Code. This is an important development because it's the first time the concept of voluntary consent and autonomy of the research participant was discussed. But as a one of the criticisms of the Nuremberg Code was doctors and physicians, researchers during those times felt it as highly restrictive, because without the consent, probably you can't do any kind of research work in humans. And that what was highlighted during that time is children who should be part of the research, because they are children are not small adults. So that uh, because they cannot provide consent, you cannot include them in research. And similarly, some other scenarios were considered highly restrictive. But this is an important development in the history of clinical research ethics, which helped build at least the start, building the framework for ethical conduct of clinical studies. Again, it's not. It doesn't mean Nuremberg Code stopped everything. It's still continued, and there are many more examples. And even today, if you just go through all the studies, I'm sure you would find studies where some of the ethical aspects have been overlooked. And it's a continuous process. It keeps improving, and I'm sure, say 30, 40 years from now, we would find a very different ethical framework with some modifications than what we have today. It doesn't mean what we have today is not adequate. It's working, but it's a continuous process where we go for an improvement. And all these studies, though not intentionally, they have helped in improving the ethical framework and guidelines around clinical research. This is, I'm sure you would know most of these studies, so I'll not go into the details, but every study here, and there are some more which I haven't listed here, but all of them are very highly unethical experiments which are done. But then it is important for us to see at that point of time, and in that perspective, when the type of ecosystem which was prevailing at that point of time. See, for example, Tuskegee syphilis study started in 1930s, and when it started in 1930s, there was actually not very effective treatment for syphilis. So it's basically an African American colony. They just wanted to see the natural history and pathophysiology of syphilis. If they left untreated, what happens? It's today it would sound very horrific, but that is which was. But the real horror of the study is by 1940s there was already penicillin, and it was known that syphilis can be completely cured. And the researchers did not offer a treatment to the participants, and it went on till 1972 until some of the researchers came out and published the ethical issues with the study. And this ended up with huge settlements, and Bill Clinton publicly apologizing from the federal government. This is again an important study because this led to I think the Belmont report after this study. It's 1974. And then the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital study is also an important study because here elderly and patients with different comorbidities in this particular hospital in 1963 were injected cancer cells. The idea was to see, because by then it was already known that if you inject cancer cells into healthy human beings, it's typically the body rejects cancer cells, so it's not dangerous. But they wanted to see what happens if the patients were having comorbidities, and then what happens to them. But the issue here is not so much but this was never told to the patients why exactly what is being injected, and the physicians defended it by saying they will be scared, and it's really not necessary to scare them because it's thought that it would not be harmful. So that is that consent thing was not there. So that is one. And then there's the Willowbrook infectious hepatitis study. Again, here children mentally challenged were injected with hepatitis virus. the justification for this study was that anyway they'll get infected with hepatitis. So really, you're not, because of Willowbrook, the community there is known for high infection of hepatitis. So it is anyway in community they'll gain hepatitis infection. So they are just infecting them in an experiment. So that was a justification given. The Milgram study is a psycho social experiment where they just wanted to see how you every study is very interesting. I can go on discussing them. But I just recommend that you read. And Milgram study is not even an intervention. It's not a pharmacological intervention. It was a psychosocial experiment. But the stress it induced in these participants and a very beautiful study, which you just cannot do it today. And the thalidomide disaster, which most of you would be aware, the thalidomide, the drug which was marketed for morning sickness in pregnant women, led to heavy teratogenic events, the phacomelia. So every study here has ethical issues. It has significantly harmed participants. But though all of us know about these, but it's important to remember them because, as George Santana said, those who forget the history are condemned to repeat it. It is important. Every study of this has helped in framing regulations and guidelines around clinical research. Okay, so then one important development is Declaration of Helsinki, because if for the members, if you see the protocols of today, we make a statement on Declaration of Helsinki, and even the good clinical practice of ICH has its origins in the Declaration of Helsinki of 1964. This actually initiated immediately after the the Nuremberg Code in 1947. It was basically discussed first in 1947 meeting of WMA, and then it was subsequently discussed in a couple of meetings. And in 1964, it got adopted. The latest revision is to the 7th revision, which is in 2013. So just to summarize, this is actually a guideline which for research in humans, and also the data originated from humans and any biological material taken from them. The important aspect is the well-being of human subjects should take precedence over the interests of science and society. So that this is a very today it is common. We think this is the norm, but in those days this is a significant change in thought process, because the interest of the human participant is more important than the interest of science and society. Only when there is harmonization between the two, that is something is a good research. So that was a very nice concept which was developed and provided autonomy to the subject participating in this research. And this Declaration of Helsinki also talks about benefit risk analysis and how benefits should outweigh risks. There should be an independent ethics committee reviewing the protocol and giving a continued approval, which we follow even today. And the concept of written informed consent and also assent in children, that was also discussed in Declaration of Helsinki, and publishing findings, positive or negative, so that it will help society. So that concept was discussed. Restricting the use of placebos, because it was observed that placebo control studies, while best for science, but may not be the best options for the subjects participating. That was covered. The post-trial access, which is a very controversial aspect of Declaration of Helsinki, was discussed and further revised later. And then one more component which I personally feel very controversial and I cringe every time I read this. They said it's only justified if there's a reasonable likelihood that the populations in which the research is carried out stand to benefit from the results of the research. But the challenge with this is even today, like we do conduct studies like the pharma industry, where some of the studies which are done purely for US and Europe, but we would do the study in India, especially something like a generic bioequivalence studies, and that it's not compliant with a guideline like this. But then this does not say whether they meant regional or whether they meant the vulnerable population. Its clarity is not there, and this was highly debated, controversial, but revision on this was never made. That's what I remember until 2013. Okay, and then the way I kind of convince myself on this is because many of the drugs what we use today have been tested initially in the US and Europe population, so that they don't get tested in Indian population or even emerging markets or the underdeveloped. But we continue to reap the benefit of such research which is conducted in US and Europe. So that way that there is some kind of payoff, even though our population do participate in the generic drugs, but uh, though which might not eventually help them, which are purely for export purposes. But still, overall, it is just it's Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. It's all are in together in this as humanity, and every subject who participates, whether here or any other region, um, helps promoting health globally. It's global health. So that way, I think it is still justifiable to conduct these studies. And obviously, when all other ethical principles have been taken care of. I'll not go into there are actually many other guidelines which came. Many are related to the common rule of the CFR in the US, but these are so much relevant to the US guidelines, so I'll not go into that. But Belmont report is an important one, even though US government initiated it, because this came after the Tuskegee trial. So it talked about important principles, the three principles which are known from Belmont report, which I personally like: the respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. These are the three concepts which are the basis for many other ethics guidelines in the which were about to come at this point of time. Respect for persons is the autonomy, and it is the informed consent process is generates from this principle. Beneficence is more the risk benefit analysis, and justice is equitable representation of patients, where the people who are supposed to get benefited, they will participate in the research. And the vice versa. So that's the three fundamental principles according to Belmont report. And as I mentioned earlier, this is the first time they also made a clear distinction between clinical medicine and clinical research. Okay, so now coming to today's topic, the ICH and the GCP. So ICH was created in 1990s. It's early 1990s. This was actually initially the need came from the pharmaceutical industry, because each of these regions had different guidelines. Because by this time, every ethical flaw would make a change to the guideline, and so that there were different guidelines across regions, which some more procedural differences, though conceptually in spirit they were same, but there are procedural issues between them. So that was affecting global development of drugs. And it used to a lot of duplication which was happening at this point of time. So that is when the key economies, the EU, Japan, and US came together to harmonize regional requirements for registration of drug products. So ICH was originally written to smoothen this process of approval of drugs in these spaces. But then it was such a document which is so comprehensive that it can be applied to even non-registrational studies or any other clinical research in general. Not all, I'm just talking about the E6. But yeah, but most of the other components which we'll discuss is it's basically targeted towards harmonizing the process of approval of drugs. This is a unique, I'm not sure if there were anything like this earlier, but this was a unique because the industry and regulators joined together to do this. Industry, it's not like a one specific company, but it is like the association of industry representatives. So that they joined together. So that is a unique and maybe probably the first time it happened in pharma industry. The objectives were clear: the improve efficiency of new drug development and registration process to basically avoid duplication. And it was happening both preclinical testing and clinical testing. You had to repeat studies every time you want to get an approval in another country. So if a drug is approved in the US, if you want to go to Japan, it is just overall new clinical development, new preclinical development, which really did not make sense. It is, first of all, it's not ethical, because if there's already a drug which is which is known to be effective, there's really no need to repeat most of the work. Maybe you can just test it once in that particular population, assuming there can be ethnic differences, but there's really no need to duplicate the whole part of it. And then the second part, it's the optimization of work. It's as you are aware, the cost of drug development is significant. It is, and eventually that will be passed on to the patients. So this way, if you can optimize some of these processes, you can reduce the work. It would eventually help patients in getting more access to the drugs. The latest assessment is that it costs almost $2.3 billion on an average to develop a drug, a novel kind of molecule. So that's the kind of cost involved in drug development. So this ICH has significantly helped. It would have been much more, but it has helped in reducing that cost. The ICH members, the founding members, as I said, it was Europe, US, and Japan, PMDA, FDA, and EC. But then there are a lot of new members who joined. Right now, we have Brazil, Mexico, Egypt, Singapore, Korea, South Korea, and then UK, China, Saudi Arabia, Chinese Taipei, Turkey. I think the latest is UK, as last year they joined. India is right now not a member, but they are an observer of ICH. And the standing members are Health Canada and Swissmedic. Yeah, so there's a huge list of observers. Maybe I'll not go through it. But let us see what is covered in ICH. ICH is divided into 4 different sections. There's a safety, efficacy, quality, and multidisciplinary. It's often referred to as SEQM or QSEM. So as you remember, and each section has different aspects which are important for clinical new drug, not clinical, but new drug development. So there's a safety section which focuses on the carcinogenicity studies, genotoxicity, pharmacotoxicity studies, and there's an efficacy section. It's all related to the clinical development, clinical research. And there's a quality section more on the manufacturing, CMC, that part. And there's a multidisciplinary, which is more accessory kind of things. And in efficacy, there is one guideline on good clinical practice, and that is E6. And here in the list, you just see the topics, but actually when it gets converted to guidelines, there are many. For example, in efficacy, there must be like 21 guidelines. E6 is good clinical practice. Similarly, say E3 is clinical study reports. The clinical trial is the designs of clinical trials is E8. So there are many. E21, I think that is the last right now. So that's the different guidelines. In each of these sections, there are so many further guidelines. So it's a very comprehensive work in ICH. And it covers every aspect of clinical drug development, and it keeps getting revised as and when there is a need comes in. Let's say gene therapy comes, they'll update it. If there's a decentralized clinical trial comes, so that will get updated with the guideline. So it's a living work which continues to get revised regularly. And very comprehensive work. And even now, there is working groups where both industry and regulators work together. Okay, so what we'll do is let us focus on good clinical practice as discussed. Good clinical practice is, as I said, ICH E6. It is one of the guidelines in the whole ICH framework under efficacy section. GCP is a standard. Again, this definition is directly taken from the E6. It's a standard for the design, conduct, performance, monitoring, auditing, recording, analysis, and reporting of clinical trials that provides assurance that the data and reported results are credible and accurate, and that the rights, integrity, and confidentiality of trial subjects is protected. So as you can see, it's the scientific aspects and the ethics go together. You just cannot separate. So they are the two pillars of GCP. The first one is the data and reported results are credible and accurate. So that is one pillar. And the second pillar is the rights, integrity, and confidentiality of trial subjects is protected. Just cannot have either way. It both have to be taken care of. And GCP lays guidelines around that. So that's the good clinical practice. So it's basically ethics plus quality data. Both are important. How do you protect research subjects? The subject safety aspect should be monitored. The risk patient might go through by participating in the study. So that is an important aspect. And then rights as subjects. So you have right to be informed, right not to participate, right to withdraw at any time without any issues, so any challenges for further care, right to protection of privacy, confidentiality aspects, and there are many other rights which are covered. And then the second part, which is how do you ensure there's a quality and integrity of research data? So a protocol should be evaluated whether it is scientifically sound to address the research question which is in place, and then whether the study conduct has the quality aspects taken care of, and whether the clinical study had proper oversight. So that is one aspect. So good clinical practice covers both, and that's why there are many stakeholders in GCP. So I think maybe before that we'll go into GCP sections, how it is divided, and this may change next year because the structure of R3 revision has changed. But for now, let us focus on this. So there is a glossary section which is around 60 odd definitions of different terms used in clinical research, and good clinical practice has been defined. And then there is a section on principles of GCP. There are 13 principles of GCP which have been laid out. And in R3 there's a difference, but in the R2 right now there are 13 principles. And the third section is on the IRB and IAC, or it covers its responsibilities of IRB, it covers composition of IRB and the procedures of IRB. So that is covered, but this is just a guideline, and obviously IRB will have its own SOPs, but they will be based on these guidelines. And the fourth section is on investigator. This talks about investigator responsibilities and different procedures involved in the investigator. So at the clinical site. So that is covered in the fourth section. Then there's a sponsor responsibilities in the fifth section. Sixth is a clinical trial protocol. The protocol, what should be covered in the protocol, and kind of template, and what should be disclosed in the protocol. So that is covered in the sixth. Seventh is investigators brochure. This is a reference safety information for a new drug to be developed, and the what should be covered in IB is there in section 7. And there's a section 8 called essential documents. This is further divided into prior to the study, during the study, and after the study. So this covers all the different documents which are needed to be in place before you start the work on clinical research. So this is very extensive, that there are like several 20, 13 documents in every section, every phase of the study. So so basically, as I said, ICS-GCP is more planned towards or targeting drug approvals, so for regulatory approvals. And these are all these documents are relevant in that setting, but they'll definitely add value even if they can be applied to other research which are not necessarily being done for regulatory approval of drugs. And we can go into glossary. We'll start, but again, feel free to stop me anywhere if you have any questions, or we can also take questions after the presentation. Okay. As I said, there are more than 60 terminologies defined in this section. I'll not go into the all of them, but some of them which are relevant for today's presentation. As I said initially, I thought you would be covering mostly for the IEC members. So that's I just picked up some important ones for the IEC members. IEC is defined this way: an independent body, a review board or a committee, institutional, regional, national, or supranational, constituted of medical professionals and non-medical members, whose responsibility it is to ensure the protection of the rights, safety, and well-being of human subjects involved in a trial, and to provide public assurance of that protection by, among other things, reviewing and approving, providing favorable opinion on the trial protocol, the suitability of the investigators, facilities, and the methods and material to be used in obtaining and documenting informed consent of the trial subjects. It's a very comprehensive definition, because when you go and look at the composition of IAC, when you look at the principles and responsibilities of the IAC, this definition covers almost every aspect of it. There are two words, right? There's an independent ethics committee is one, and then institutional review board. For some reason, which I could never understand, is ICS-GCP defines them separately, but definition itself does have some minor differences, but technically they mean the same. This was always a question: what is the difference between an IEC and IRB? There's really no difference in the way it is defined or handled. And that has been corrected in the R3. And if you see the glossary of R3, IEC and IRB are defined together. So that now there's a clarity that at least they are interchangeable at ICH level. So that is the thought process. But until now, it is always a confusion. Is there a difference between IAC and IRB? Because they are defined differently. I mean, not differently, they mean something similar, but there are some minor differences. For example, here they talk about providing public assurance, which is not there in IRB. So, but that did not have any material effect. And adverse event, I just picked this up because there is sometimes there is this misunderstanding and confusion between adverse event and adverse drug reaction. So adverse event is any untoward medical occurrence in a patient or clinical investigation subject administered a pharmaceutical product and which does not necessarily have a causal relationship with this treatment. So the important line in the words is here, does not necessarily have a causal relationship. So technically anything which patient complaints or is observed in a patient or participant should be documented as an adverse event. This is important, because in one of the ethics committees where we worked, we saw a couple of studies with absolutely no adverse events reported. So we had to intervene and ask why there are no adverse events. So just to ensure that whether the investigator understands what is adverse event. Because as I said, there's a distinction between clinical research and clinical medicine. Say something like a patient meeting with an accident while coming to the clinic, a physician might just say it has nothing to do with the drug and just ignore to document something like that, which technically would meet a definition of serious adverse event. That is a major violation. That's why I just picked up adverse event as one of the terms which I wanted to explain here. And then confidentiality, this prevention of disclosure to other than authorized individuals of a sponsor's proprietary information or of a subject's identity. Again, this is very important because at least I've seen at places where we don't give so much importance for confidentiality. Confidentiality of the patient's identifiable information, how it is protected, and especially in though there are processes in the industry-driven trials because it is important, it is built into the system, but many times we see that is not being followed very well in non-industry sponsored trials and trials which more like the dissertations, and it's not very well followed. So that's why it is important to understand the confidentiality part of it. So that there is responsibility for everyone, but at least for today's discussion, we can focus on protecting the identifiable information of of the patients participating. And then documentation, very important in clinical research. All records in any form, it's written, electronic, magnetic, X-rays, ECGs, anything, all of that is a document. And it should, and there are guidelines surrounding them on how it should be documented. And GCP also has a different responsibilities under investigator on how these documentation should be maintained and recorded, collected. All of that is there. It's a GCP is a very good document, very comprehensive. It covers a lot of such nice aspects. So that documentation is that all of these are considered as documentation, whichever related to the clinical study in any form. And impartial witness and legally acceptable representatives, two other things where we always get into trouble. As impartial witness is a person who is independent of the trial, who cannot be unfairly influenced by people involved with the trial, who attends the informed consent process if the subject or the subject's legally acceptable representative cannot read, and who reads the informed consent form and any other written information supplied to the subject. Here also, and there is another concept called legally acceptable representative. Here it's an individual or juridical or other body authorized under applicable law to consent on behalf of a prospective subject to the subject's participation in the clinical trial. What we have observed here is in India, at least, because you want to do more, so always they end up taking both. If the patient is not able to read well, they just take LAR and impartial witness, so that there is no risk. That's how it is taken care of. But it also means when patient can technically consent, and if you're using an LAR, it means you're undermining the capability to consent by the patient, so which is not really necessary. So you need an impartial witness when patient is illiterate, and the impartial witness should be really impartial, because when I started my clinical trials as a sub-investigator, our impartial witness is always one of the staff in our clinical research center, which is not really impartial, but that is the easy person to get when we are doing the consenting process. So those kind of, I'm sure those things have improved now, but these can be contested in a court of law for whether the impartial witness is really impartial. So that's why it is important as a ethics committee to ensure it is taken care of in these studies, because ethics committees are responsible to also conduct inspections and audits to ensure the investigator is conducting these studies fairly and according to guidelines. So at that time, these things should be checked. And LARs, because while I do say this, but we have also practiced where, just to be sure, especially we conducted a lot of schizophrenia studies in a couple of years back. So that time we had this issue of impartial witness and LARs, because as schizophrenia, whether the patient has insight or not is important. And if the patient does not have insight, it is good to have a legally acceptable representative, because you do not know the patient's capability to consent, to understand the risks of the study. So, but then someone has to determine whether patient can really consent or not. And that would require another step where a independent psychiatrist evaluates patient for his capability to consent. But these things add a lot of additional challenges. That's where you get into this discussion of LAR versus impartial witness, and now we also have additional requirements for vulnerable population, which is not so much discussed in the ICS-JCP, but it is from the Indian context. Okay, so that's some differences which we should be aware of. And then the informed consent, which is the most critical aspect of good clinical practice. It's a process by which a subject voluntarily confirms his or her willingness to participate in a particular trial after having been informed of all aspects of the trial that are relevant to the subject's decision to participate. Informed consent is documented by means of a written, signed, and dated informed consent form. We can actually speak for hours only on the informed consent. There are so many issues here, and this we see on a regular basis. Not so much in the again industry sponsored trials, because they follow something like essential components of an ICF and they fill it. Again, that is also not very good, because it leads to 15-20 pages of consent, which would take really a lot of time for a patient to understand. And so that is the other side of the risk. But most of the other studies which we see, which are more academic studies, the challenge we see is the risks are not communicated well, or there's not enough information there. And even if there is information, it is not communicated in a language patient can understand. So informed consent is something which is actually completely the responsibility of ethics committee to ensure it is relevant, appropriate, and patients can understand it well. And there's also informed consent delivery process, which is again a different discussion on how it has been administered to the patient, and whether how do you ensure that patient has understood what is there in the consent and the patient information sheet. And maybe the last one is the vulnerable subjects we'll discuss. Individuals whose willingness to volunteer in a clinical trial may be unduly influenced by the expectation, whether justified or not, of benefits associated with participation, or for a retaliatory response from senior members of a hierarchy in case of refusal to participate. So here it may be, if you are planning to conduct a study in students, like that is what most of our ethics committee members we see is institutions will be planning to conduct a study in their own students, and whether that will be considered as vulnerable subjects and whether their interests are protected. Similarly, children and patients in emergency situation. So there are different scenarios which you face regularly on how the rights of vulnerable subjects is taken care of in the way the study is designed, and the informed consent process has been taken care of. Okay, that's about the glossary. So let us go into principles of ICS GCP. As I said, this is the second part of the second section in the ICS GCP after the glossary. So there are 13. They are not been divided according to the as I have divided here, like different sections. It's a continuous number of 1 to 30. But just for easier understanding, I've tried to group under different sections, and this is usually that's how it is always presented. The first part is kind of first three principles talk on the ethics part of it. So there is ethical conduct of clinical trials. GCP refers to Declaration of Helsinki here, and the principles origin during the DOH. So that it talks about that's the first principle. The second principle is on the beneficence, that is benefits to the trial subject and to the society should justify the risks subject is taking in the study. So that's the risk benefit analysis is covered in the ethics in the second principle. And the third principle is the important one, which you know, the right, safety, and well-being of subjects prevail over interest to science and society, which is an important concept in any clinical research, whether it is for regulatory approval or non-regulatory approval. But that's a very important concept. The second group is on the scientific part of the clinical research. Their available non-clinical and clinical information and so far should support the conduct of the trial. And it's an important aspect. Many times we skip this part, but it is important to see what is already collected and whether that is supporting the current study or whether it's just a duplication. Sometimes we do see such studies which may be just a duplication which have been conducted, but that information is already there. And sometimes you might see some risks in non-clinical data or the previous clinical study, and whether the investigator and the sponsor is taking care of that risk adequately and in the design. So if you go to the R3 talks about quality by design. So these aspects should be built into it. the quality by design, the way the protocol is designed, and the way rescues are built into the study. So that will come in there. The fifth principle is on the study should be conducted in complete compliance with the scientifically sound and detailed protocol. There should be no protocol waivers, because as a rule in our company, we never allow protocol waivers. So it is studies should be conducted in compliance with that protocol which is designed. And then next three principles on the responsibilities. The protocol should be approved by IRB IEC before initiating the study, even before the first patient signs the consent. And the protocol and study should be conducted in complete compliance with the protocol. The seventh one is the medical care, the medical decisions in the treatment of the subject should always be made by a qualified physician or dentist. Again, as I said, GCP is written more for studies related to regulatory approvals of drugs. That's why the statement is it's that a qualified physician should be taking care of the medical care and decisions. But if it's not a non-interventional study, it may not be relevant. And that is actually one of the criticisms of the ICH-JCP. The ICH-JCP is trying to address everything. It is one size fits all kind of approach. And that has been taken care of in the next revision, so that where they clearly define the scope of the study. Because here in the R2 version, there's no clear scope is never defined. So that has been taken care of the next revision. Okay, so coming back to the principles, the eighth principle is that there is a clear role for every individual to play, and that person should be qualified to do that work. So there's a delegation law typically in a clinical trial based on the qualification of individual participating in the study. So that's the part of the responsibility principle. And then there is one principle, ninth, on the informed consent. Informed consent should be freely given from every subject prior to participation. No coercion, and it should be a written consent. Then there are two principles on the data quality and integrity. It is clinical trial information should be recorded, handled, and stored for accurate reporting, interpretation, and verification. So this we discussed as part of documentation. So that is covered here. And then protect confidentiality of records, which can identify subjects, which again discusses the data integrity and also confidentiality. Then the 12th principle is on the IP, that is investigational product. It should be manufactured, handled, and stored in accordance with the good manufacturing practices, that's GMP, and used accordance with approved protocol. So that's on the 12th. And the last principle is related to quality control and assurance. Systems with procedures to ensure quality of every aspect of the trial should be implemented. So that this has been further focused in the R2 revision, where how the quality system should be built into the study, and it is further focused and emphasized in the R3, which is going to come. So that is where this particular part of the principle is becoming very critical in clinical research. Okay, so R2 addendum, this came in 2016, and it has been amended to encourage implementation of improved and more efficient approaches. Whereas from 96 to 2016, there are a lot of changes have happened in the clinical trial research. There are new types of clinical trial designs have come, new technologies in clinical trials have come. So to address some of those needs, and also basically to ensure remote oversight, building quality into the oversight, and the remote monitoring aspects, all of that is covered in the addendum. It's actually not a significant addition. It is just some clarifications added at different sections in the R2. So yeah, I mentioned about the different stakeholders in GCP. So there are sponsors, contract research organizations, investigators, study site staff, IRBs, research subjects, and the regulators. So all of these are the stakeholders of clinical research, and each of them have their own responsibilities and rights. So that is covered in GCP in different sections. What I thought is I'll just focus on the IRB responsibilities because I originally thought this would be for the IRB members. But I'll be happy to discuss anything else. Just this is 3.3, section 3. But similarly, every section has multiple different the responsibilities, procedures, and composition related information. So 3.1 is on IRB responsibilities. So the first responsibility is safeguard the rights, safety, and well-being of all trial subjects. Second is review essential documents of all of clinical trials. It many essential documents identified, which also further discussed in ICJCP at later sections. So they should be reviewed by the IRB. It is important because many times, even myself included, we are guilty of not reviewing all of this, and that can lead to challenges, and that can lead us to make not so right decisions with the studies, and also the continuing review, which we don't focus so much on. So that these things should be followed because these are have legal liabilities if we miss things on this, and that's where very critical, especially in the interventional studies. Third principle is third responsibility is consider the qualifications of the investigator for the proposed trial. So we usually go with an assumption most often, but it is important to review the CV of the investigator and if they have the right qualification to conduct a study like that. The fourth principle is conduct continuing review. Fourth responsibility, conduct continuing review of each ongoing trial at intervals at least once per year. And again, this will depend on how we have written our SOP at the ethics committee. So, but that has to be followed, and that should be documented, that continued review. The fifth responsibility is may request for more information be given to subjects when additional information would add meaningfully to the protection of the subjects. Again, this is an important one which usually people will miss. And very easy to miss. But for example, if you come across an adverse event which happened in the patients prior to this patient's participation, and if it is considered related to the study drug, even whether it in your site or in some other site, the patient should be aware of it. And then whenever you make the determination whether that information should be shared with our subjects before participation, or even those who are already participating, whether they would this information will make their decision to change based on this, whether to continue participation or not. So that is one of the responsibility of IRB. And the sixth is when a non-therapeutic trial to be carried out with the consent of the subject's LAR, determine that the proposed protocol adequately addresses relevant clinical ethical concerns and meets applicable regulatory requirements. Again, this has been now removed in the upcoming revision. Because there it is mostly focusing on all this focusing on therapeutic trials.
Prasanna, we have, I mean, that we have crossed the time now. How many?
Oh, sorry. Then I'll just quickly go. There are further responsibilities, which 9 responsibilities. And then I'll just go into composition, function, operations, because I'm sure there is a follow-up discussion where we will discuss the ethics committee framework and the responsibilities. I think Dr. Animesh or Dr. Care would take. So I'll skip this. Again, basically what GCP is giving is some directions on how IRB should be composed and the functions and how it should be operated. I'll just skip these and procedures and records. These are the other sections which I'm not going into detail. The procedures talk about how to establish and how to document in writing all these procedures. So there's an SOP should be there and that part. And then the records, up to 3 years, you should retain the records. And there's a difference between here and Indian GCP here, but not so relevant. ICH R3, maybe then I'll skip. But basically what's happening is they're changing the structure. They're changing the scope only to the interventional clinical trials. And the structure is changed because it will help for quick revisions. Now principles is a separate document, and then you have annexures. So annexures can always be added. That is the thought process behind it. Maybe if there is time, we can come back to this. So it's new one. Okay. Oh, yeah, I'll just leave you with this case, which is important because IRB was indicted in this and thought that they did not have enough checks and balances. You might already be aware of this case where Jesse Gelsinger, who suffered from OTC deficiency, X-linked genetic disease of liver, but he had this partial deficiency. So that means it's an X-linked. So he was not affected by the clinical symptoms. He participated in a clinical trial of Genova. Genova was the sponsor, and it was supported by Biogen. Uh, and he died after 4 days of first injection. And this was it was an adenoviral vector, and it was thought that this high dose of adenoviral vector has led to serious immune response, which led to multiple organ failure and brain death. Okay, so this was very unfortunate because it led to a kind of temporary stop for many of the other gene therapy products during that point of time. And when they started investigating this particular case, because this went into court and with a huge settlement, I think around $10 million. So here they identified that there was a conflict of interest because Dr. Wilson, who was the principal investigator, was also the founder of Genova. He had 30% ownership. And there was an inadequate ICF process. They did not inform about the how this infusion would be done because ICF did not have that part. And Dr. Wilson's conflict of interest was not part of the ICF. And ICF was, there was initially one version of the ICF had one of the preclinical data where monkeys died when this was there, but then it was removed because it was felt non-relevant to the ICF. And there was no mention of prior patients who had serious adverse events, but it was in the same study. So usually there is a time lag where you introduce that into the ICF process. And there are many, few guidelines, not many really, it's which were violated. Change in method of injection was not communicated to the FDA Genetic Recombination Committee because this is the early days of gene therapy where any change in the protocol has to be communicated. That was not done. Investigators did not report liver toxicity observed in the previous patients, as I mentioned. And there was a protocol violation because it's an X-linked disorder. It was first 2 months should be treated before treating a male volunteer. That was a requirement. And on the day of injection, there was a slightly elevated liver enzymes of Mr. Gelsinger. So even if they had done all of this correct, it was such an unfortunate rare case, even it would have ended up the same. But what is important is because of these violations, while today, because in the background of death, these look very serious, but when you are evaluating a protocol like this, these are the ones you would easily overlook as an IRB committee. And this would lead to something. So basically, these will come into play if something serious happens, even though it's not related to it. And the company almost went bankrupt. Dr. Wilson, such a decorated scientist, he had to stop the center of research he had in the University of Penn. They had to go for a large settlement with the father of the victim. So the IRB was said to be, because this didn't go into trial, but if it had gone to trial, the IRB would have been indicted in this. The point here is the many things which we overlook, thinking it is all fine. It's not, but it can come back biting at us. So it's a being sitting in IRB is it's a great responsibility, which has significant risks to the society, to the subjects, and to personally as well. So that's why it is important to follow these guidelines to the word, and that is critical many times, which you overlook. It is important to spend time and ensure that has been taken care of. Yeah, so I think maybe that's where I'll stop. Sorry for running over on the time. I did not even realize that I was going about. Okay. But happy to answer if there are any questions, but we can also take the questions later once we end all the sessions.
Thank you, Dr. Prasanna, for such an elaborate talk on this ICP and GCP guideline. I know it's a very vast topic to cover in 1 hour. I know, and for us to understand also a lot of things, as a part of a AC member, there's a lot of responsibility on us. I just have one question because the Declaration of Helsinki mentioned that you have to, the post-trial access to the treatment. So I don't think many of the clinical trials which were involved. So do you think that if the sponsor says that they're not going to give post-trial access to treatment, do we not take up the study? Is it a part of it? Is it important for us?
It's a very controversial one, which is there are at least a couple of clarifications have come on that. It is not always possible. Like who owes who something. So that is where it is. So what we follow is nowadays DCGI themselves ask for it. For example, if you are conducting a study with 3-4 cycles of chemotherapy, agency will come back and ask, well, why don't you continue it for so many further cycles? Now, most of the FDA approval studies, we go until, I'm talking more from an onco perspective, where you continue the treatment until progression. So it is something which ethics committees and investigators have to make a decision. Though it is there in Declaration of Helsinki, it is not covered in many of the regulatory guidelines. It is on us. It is very subjective. So definitely we would not be happy to approve a product which comes just you approve for 2 injections and patient goes back to some other therapy. There should be a reasonable time frame which is acceptable in clinical medicine, where patients should be treated with it. So that is something which is very subjective and case by case. That is what we are doing even at the organization. And even CDSEO is also very careful about it, and then they always come back with whenever they see some protocols with such requirements of just 2-3 cycles and patient is out on themselves. So that is not happening nowadays. But usually, like 1-year studies is something it should be fine. Like once you use dry AMD, diabetic macular edema here, where 1-year treatment is typical norm nowadays.
Okay, thank you. I think Dr. Divakar had a question. Dr. Surinder answered the question in the chat box. So we have our next speaker, Dr. Surinder Kher. He's a clinical development expert with experience in biological and clinical sciences and a physician by training. He spent several years in clinical practice before joining the pharmaceutical industry. He has experience working with private and public organizations on programs related to infectious diseases, vaccine development, antimicrobial resistance, and related initiatives and rare disease development programs, besides other therapeutic areas. And he's also associated with various clinical research bodies in advisory roles. He's currently advisor at BioQuest Solution and executive head of clinical research at Aster Hospital, Bangalore. So we welcome you to give a speech on new drug clinical trial 2019.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Okay, let me try to get my presentation on.
You're able to see, sir. Make just full
Can
screen.
you see this? I'll try to get it onto the full screen. Give me a minute. Okay, I'm just getting it. Having a little bit of difficulty in getting it onto a full screen.
So you have that icon in the lower part?
Yeah, I'm just that icon is not available to me right now because this is coming to it.
Okay, we are able to see that. But
Yeah, you can see that, but I am not able to get to that icon. But anyway, let's start. I think once we start, probably it will. So thank you everyone, and I'm glad to be here to present to you what are the regulations that we have in our country. Dr. Prasanna did talk to you about all the GCP guidance, all the GCP guidelines, what from an ethics perspective is required, what is required from a clinical research point of view. But I guess, as my understanding was also that this is limited to, ethics committees and members of the ethics committee. But, our laws, which are framed, the new drug and clinical trial rules, I have taken out certain aspects which are important from a clinical research point of view. Now, I'm sure most of the attendants today, the audience would include mostly researchers, doctors, investigators, maybe students as well, who are participating and doing their dissertations, doing their studies, and submitting to their thesis and everything else. So it all applies to all of them. And a lot of times we take these things very, very lightly, as Dr. Prasanna mentioned, even sitting in ethics committees or even people who want to do investigator-initiated research, on disease patterns, on a lot of other things. So regulations remain the same for all clinical research. Now, in India, there is a little bit of difference what we see in the CFR or what we talk about the US or the European Union. We have to follow the law of the land. Now, I will take up some of these issues and maybe it will address some of the questions that people might have in their minds. So, from a definitions point of view, and the laws have been defined, the new drug and clinical. I'll give a little bit of background. See, initially everything was covered under the Drugs and Cosmetic Act. It still is. In that, we had a Schedule Y, which was covering all the clinical research requirements in whatever trials or whatever research you would do. It was covered. And then we had the ICMR guidelines. I'm sure we'll be talking about it a little later. And those were the two. ICMR guideline was just a guideline. It never was a law till we had Schedule Y, unless it was incorporated into the GCP guidelines, then it becomes a law indirectly. So now with the new clinical trial rules, we have everything is a law. Even the ICMR guideline is a law. It's not a guideline. Okay, because it's referenced in your new drugs and clinical trial rules. So the new drugs and clinical trial rules came in 2019, and there have been smaller changes happening, amendments, which might be most of them are administrative, but I will address some of those which were done in, I think, by the time of 2022 December, till that time, and which were not many. We'll just address those a little bit at the end. So all these laws which have been framed are from a perspective of drug laws. Now, when we talk about, if you see the definition of a clinical trial, it says the clinical trial in relation to a new drug. So everything is with a drug. I would address this a little bit more because it's not just a drug, because even devices come under drugs today, as of now. So any intervention, I would say research intervention would include that. So a clinical trial in relation to a new drug or an investigational new drug means any systematic study of such new drug or an investigational new drug in human subjects to generate clinical or pharmacological, including pharmacodynamics or adverse effects, to understand the safety and efficacy of and the tolerance of that particular drug. This is how it is defined in the new drugs and clinical trial rules. Now, when we talk about some of these definitions, you please relate, and I'm sure there'll be many questions. People sitting in the audience would always be thinking, oh, I have data. Can I start a trial now? When should I do it? Whether I need to go to ethics committee, whether I need to go to DCGI. We will try to address some of those questions in this presentation. I'm just trying to see if I can still get to the full screen.
So you could select the slideshow option on top, sir.
Is
Next to
there
the
a
animation on
slide
right on top, slideshow. In text, you will find it on top.
on the
You
top?
insert. Further up, sir, next to animation.
Okay.
To your right, you will see slideshow before the record, between animation and record. The opposite side.
Okay, okay. Animation
Just click
and
slideshow, sir.
yes, yes, yes. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that help. So what is an academic clinical trial? So this is important because most of us do a lot of academic research, not always a drug research. Now, an academic clinical trial means a clinical trial of a drug. Again, because everything is related to drug, the definitions in the CT rules is already means a clinical trial of a drug which is already approved for a certain claim and initiated by an investigator, an academic or a research institution for a new indication or a new route of administration or new dose or new dosage form where the results of such trial are intended to be used only for academic or research purposes, not for seeking approval of central licensing authority. Let me explain this. So basically, when we say academic clinical trial, we're talking about drugs. If you're using an intervention, that intervention or a drug is already approved in the marketplace for a particular indication. Now, if I want to start a clinical trial using the same drug, which means the safety of this drug is already known. So there is no concern from a safety point of view. So you can choose a new indication and want to invest. Say typically in oncology drugs, if we are looking at, solid tumors, if a drug is, uh, already approved for, let's say, breast cancer, and you want to see that you feel based on whatever experience you have, and you have gone by research and say that I should try it in even, a gallbladder cancer, then you might actually want to do that in gallbladder cancer, but there are certain limitations to it. So, which will be means you are doing a new indication, or you might want to change the route of administration of that drug, or use a dose which is within the limits of the dose which we have. And this will only be for the purpose of academics. This data that you will generate out of it cannot be used for seeking approval to the regulatory authority. A lot of times, what happens is pharmaceutical companies or biotechnology companies would want, they give a grant to the investigator, say that, hey, can you do this? And go for a publication. So, which is perfectly fine. You can go for a publication, but that data cannot be used to the regulator to seek additional indication approval. So that's very clear. Okay, so that's how we differentiate between an academic clinical trial and the clinical trial, which is more interventional at standard for regulatory purposes. And so this differentiation, you keep in this mind, we'll address this a little bit more again. What is an interventional study? Now, this is again, because a lot of times, most of our students keep coming and saying that this is everything is observational because you're observing everything, but there is an interventional, even if you are administering or assigning patients to groups. So that's how it is defined. A type of a clinical study in which participants are assigned to groups. That means you define who will get what or who you are intervening with. So more intervention or a treatment so that researchers can evaluate the effects of the interventions on biomedical or health related outcomes. It could be on anything. The assignments are determined by study protocol. Participants may receive diagnostic, therapeutic, or other types of interventions. So that's how an interventional study is defined. It does not necessarily mean the moment you assign them to two different treatments, then it becomes an interventional study by default by the law. What is a non-interventional observational study? A non-interventional observational study means a study in which the investigator does not assign the participants any specific treatment or any group. So these are actual definitions out of the CT rules. So please remember these. Now, whether permission is required, this is always the question people will have, whether permission is required from the DCGI for conduct of an academic clinical trial. I'm doing academic, I'm not going for any registration. Do I need to go to the DCGI for getting an getting a permission? So the answer is no. Permission for conducting an academic clinical trial will not be required for any drug, provided the clinical trial in respect of the permitted drug formulation is intended solely for academic research. When I explained in the academic clinical trial, so it again talks about the same things, that the clinical trial in respect of permitted drug formulation is intended solely for academic research, for purposes of new indication or new route of administration or new dose or new dosage form. And the clinical trial referred to above has been initiated after prior approval by the ethics committee. So ethics committee approval is mandated for any clinical trial, anything. And the observations generated, the data generated from such trials are not required to be submitted to the Central Licensing Authority, which is the CGI. And the observations of such clinical trial are not used for promotional purposes. So this is a catch here, because a lot of times when you are making a publication, then it says that it should not be used for promotional purposes, not for seeking regulatory approval. That is one part, but even for promotional purposes. So this is a caveat here. However, in the event of a possible overlap, so that's what is given to the ethics. So if we are looking at such a study which has come to the EC, if we have doubts about whether this should qualify for as an academic or a non-academic trial, so the DCJ, to be on the side of caution, says you better communicate. The EC should communicate to the DCGI if you have a doubt whether within 30 days they will come back to us, whether this should be categorized as an academic or a regular clinical trial. All right. Now, this compensation, I'm sure everybody knows about the history of how this compensation thing came up. And, after the 2013 issue, a lot of laws, the new drug and clinical trial that came in was very clear on these compensation aspects, on the medical management in case of an injury or a death of a trial subject. And is that also applicable to academic clinical trial? Because generally the understanding is, well, this is an academic trial, I'm not going to. So, but how do we protect the rights of the patients? So the academic clinical trial has to be conducted in accordance with the approved clinical trial protocol, ethical principles, as specified in the biomedical guidelines by ICMR, with a view to ensuring protection, rights, safety, and well-being of trial subjects during the conduct of such research. Therefore, ethical principles, including compensation, medical management in case of injury or death, etc., as prescribed by ICMR, are applicable for academic clinical trials. So a lot of times we run this research in hospitals, even for example, when we are doing an purpose also, because most of it is mostly observational, but even if we have an intervention, then we have to make sure that this part is covered. So as ethics committee members, we ask this question: is there an insurance cover? Are you covering this? Because medical management has to be provided, and if there is an injury, that has to be covered. So a lot of times institutions who are conducting research, for example, in Shankara, if you're conducting research, I think Shankara should take a general insurance policy, cover all kinds of academic research that runs in the hospital. Uh, you know, Sponsored trials are always covered by the insurance, but for internal research, academic research, which might be interventional, this cover is extremely important. And most of the institutions don't have it. I'm sure Shankara probably may or may not have it, but I know it's not available in most places. Whether registration of clinical trial in ICMR CTRI is mandatory. It is definitely mandatory before enrollment of first participant in any clinical trial. Because when you go for CTRI registration, you have to have at least one ethics committee approval for the study if you're doing a multi-center study. But before you enroll the first participant, it should be registered in the CTRI for sure. Now, I think in the CTRI point of view, for most of the audience, it's important. Now, one is the law for doing this, but otherwise also it is important that whatever academic research, because if the idea is publication, a lot of these publication houses do ask for requirement of a registry of the study to be registered in any, clinical trial registry, whether it's clinicaltrials.gov, the WHO registry, or the Indian CTRI. It's equally accepted worldwide, because you cannot make it, they don't allow you to publish unless you have this. So a lot of people come back to us saying that, what do we do with this? Because they can't publish. A lot of this is important. So it's important always that you can register. If you're doing a study, there's no harm registering with an intent of publication at the end of the study. Whether global clinical trial is also required to be registered in the ICMR, the obvious answer is yes in case of multi-country trial or GCT. Even if the trial is registered in WHO registry or the clinicaltrials.gov, it is important the law of the land states that CTRI details of Indian investigators, trial sites, Indian target sample size, etc. should be included in the CTRI before you start the study. Is any permission required from the CLA to conduct observational and non-interventional studies of a new drug? Now, again, we talked in the earlier slide, so we might have a little bit of misunderstanding on these aspects, but this law clearly tells us. Now, if I am doing an observational study on a new drug, we did talk about it, but here we are not talking about an academic study. Now, if a pharmaceutical company wants to do an observational study, yes, such studies are conducted with a new drug under approved conditions, which means the indication for which it has been given approval, the label of its use under the protocol approved by the central licensing authority. So the protocol has to be submitted to them. It has to be approved by them. The inclusion and exclusion subjects are decided as per the recommended use, as per the prescribing. You can't put it in any new indication. It has to be as per the label. In such studies, the study drugs are the part of treatment of the patient in the wisdom of the prescriber included in the protocol, which is again the label. However, the regulatory provisions and guidelines applicable for clinical trial of a new drug are not applicable in such cases as the drugs are already approved. So will you have, again, in such cases, if there's an injury or anything that happens to the patient, have I to take care of the compensation and other parts? The answer is no, because this is already a marketed drug. You're only doing an observational study, trying to gather data, and it's in routine patient care as long as it is within the indication for which the drug is approved. So it's very clear, very clearly defined what comes under this particular non-interventional study requirement. What is a post-marketing surveillance study? Now, again, because these are different types of studies. Now, a lot of times when new drugs are approved, the DCGI, the CDSU will mandate and of active surveillance of the study after the drug is actually marketed. So do we really need, what are the laws around that? Such studies are conducted with a new drug under approved conditions of its use under a protocol approved by the CLA. Again, you have to submit a protocol. A lot of times, I think Dr. Prasanna will relate to this. As pharmaceutical companies, we have to go back to them and they ask for it. That's part of the law. But practice-wise, they might say, go ahead and do it. With a scientific, it should have a scientific objective. Inclusion or exclusion of a subjects are decided as per the recommended use, which is again as per the label. In such studies, the study drugs are a part of treatment of the patient in wisdom of the prescriber. Regulatory provision guidelines applicable for clinical trial of a new drug are not applicable in such cases as the drugs are already approved for marketing. Whether ethics committee approval is mandatory to initiate a clinical trial. So any trial, any research which has health outcomes. Sorry, I'm having a bad throat. I might stop in between. So any kind of study, any kind of research which has an health outcome needs to go to the ethics committee. A lot of times in our routine practice, we do get saying that I have data and I didn't need to go to the ethics committee because it was just a research survey. Because if it has and you want to publish it, because if the survey has outcomes which are related to health outcomes, it is important to get to the ethics committee. And even for publication now, they will ask you for ethics committees. A lot of times we get, investigators or doctors coming in saying that I need to publish this, and they have asked me for ethics committee approval. So the study is already done, case reports and other things can be done, but you can't do a retrospective ethics committee approval. Sorry. The next question, in absence of local ethics committees, which ethics committees can approve a clinical trial? So there was a question on institutional ethics committees and independent ethics committees. So, from an Indian person, all ethics committees are actually independent. And because there are requirements which maybe we'll take up later, the head of the institution cannot be a part of the committee and things like that. The chairperson has to be outside of. So it's really independent and multidisciplinary committee. Now, in the Indian context, they had defined institutional ethics committee separately. I'm trying to address this question again before I get into this. And committees which are independent, which are not affiliated to an institution, which are like more commercial independent committees, both have an important role to play actually when we talk of research. But in the context of the Indian law, what they had done is they gave the institutional ethics committees could approve all types of clinical trials, all types of research, but they had limited only bioequivalence studies to the independent ethics committees. They could not be institutional, so they had limited to that. But that also is changing now. Newer committees which are going, because if you are doing, like a survey across the country, you don't have to go to 100 institution committees. You can do that kind of research. Those laws are not very clear yet, but I think there is an element of that which is being considered, but it's not a law as of yet. So the law today says that in absence of a local committee, you can go to another site or another institution, ethics committee, provided that the approving ethics committee for clinical trials shall be responsible for the study at the trial site, and the same shall be located within the same city or within a radius of 50 kilometers. So this is what they have defined. So the assumption was that, okay, if the ethics committee is located in Delhi and you are doing research in Bangalore, how will they have an oversight? So that was the perspective. And I think it's important even for ethics committees, because we try to take up, you know, uh, proposals which are from a different institution or a different clinic. But I think it's important from ethics committee's point of view to understand what is in that. Does that center have adequate resources for the type of study that is being approved by this committee, and there is an oversight by this committee to that to that site. That's number one. Number two, there has to be a documented MOU or some way of request which has come, and the ethics committee has agreed that they will look into it. That's another from an ethics point of view. Documentation of that, yes, we will take, not just take anything and everything without knowing what type of a center that is, unless the committee members are liable for that. That's important. Can we initiate a clinical trial straight away after deemed approval? So I'll just address this deemed approval thing. In our new clinical trial rules, because it used to, when people would make applications to the DCGI for a clinical study, there would be always, a lot of time that would be taken because there would be no response and all. With the new clinical trial rules, they defined certain timelines like 30 days, 60 days, 90 days for different aspects of applications. Now, for a trial, for example, if you would make an application and if you don't hear anything in 30 days time, it would be assumed that approval has been granted, which would be kind of a deemed approval. So that's what deemed approval actually means. And some of the amendments that have come very recently are related to that, which we will talk in the last couple of slides. But here, can we initiate a trial if it is deemed approval? Suppose I made an application saying that I want to do a study, but I didn't hear back from the DCGI, and the 30 days have passed. So can I go and start my studies? Inform the DCGI that I waited for 30 days. There are certain forms which have been defined, which are here mentioned as CT04A, 6A, 7A. There are different types of forms. And you have to communicate that to the DCGI that we are starting the study. That communication that we send back to the DCGI is for records. That is the deemed approval letter for us. So any sponsor or an investigator before initiating the clinical trial shall inform the CDSO, inform CT4A, 6A, or 7A, which we'll talk about a little later. On the basis of the said information, the CDSO shall take on record the form which shall become part of the official record and shall be called the automatic approval of by the CDSCO, by the Central Licensing Authority. What is the regulatory control on observational non-interventional studies of a drug which is not a new drug? So I'm not getting into what is a new drug and what is not a new drug, but new drug is, let's consider it for the time being as any uh, investigational drug which is not being used in India, is not approved for marketing. And in fact, there is another clause that for 4 years it continues to be a new drug. So if it falls in that category, what are the rules? What are the controls there? In case of observational non-interventional studies, uh, which is not a new drug, no approval from CLA is required. So if you are doing a non-interventional observational study of a drug which is not a new drug, if it is an existing drug, there is no approval required from the licensing authority. However, for confirmation that the study protocol is truly a protocol for an observational non-interventional study, it is advised that the applicant should submit the protocol to the CLA and wait for its response. So it is essentially telling you to make an application by law, but I know most of the time we do not do this, to be honest. But now if we have a doubt, then we should. See, as an ethics committee, what you call member, we do approve such studies, but we may not necessarily ask for a DCGI approval or a DCGI communication. So I think these are important aspects, because if tomorrow there is a query from the DCGI, so that's what it says in the second part. Otherwise, after initiation of a study without prior approval of the CLA, if it is considered by CLA not to be truly an observational non-interventional study, of it as per the regulatory action can be taken. So which means regulatory action can be taken on anybody, investigator, the sponsor, and the EC as well. So essentially, it means that you have to make an application for all practical purposes. What are the regulatory actions that could be taken in case of non-compliance with the regulatory provisions? It's the same thing. If any person, it could entail in issue of a warning letter, what I mentioned in the previous slide. If we don't follow the regulatory act laws, then issue of warning letter describing the deficiency, reject the results of the clinical trial. If you still do it, continue, suspend for such a period as considered appropriate, or cancel the permission granted, or debar the investigator or the sponsor, including his representative, to conduct any clinical trials in future. So these are some of the actions that the regulators, these are all part of the law, which are written in the drugs and cosmetics, in the CT rules. Whether phase 1 first in human study of a new drug discovered or developed outside India can be permitted to be conducted in India. A lot of times, if there is under an IND, if it is an IND, then it starts from the beginning. It's something which is developed in India. It comes through an IND. But if there is a new drug substance discovered or developed in other countries, can we do a phase 1 first in man study directly? The answer is no. So what we need to do is we need to have phase 1 data available. So which means human data should be available, which has to be submitted to the DCGI as a part of this. And the DCGI may allow then subsequently to repeat a phase 1 trial or maybe a phase 2 trial. And then, further development of this study. So we cannot do a first in man for a product if it is not an Indian discovery. If it is an Indian discovery, we're allowed to do it. Now, does it have any ethical or other implications? To me, it does have. So it wouldn't really matter, but this is the law as of today. So it wouldn't matter whether it is outside or here. Product developed anywhere is a new product. First in human will be first in human. What are the considerations for relaxation, abbreviations, omission, or deferment of non-clinical and clinical data for approval of clinical trial and a new drug? Sometimes, we know that, we need certain drugs which are extremely important, not available here, and they are not approved, but they have already been approved elsewhere. Now, if we have to go to the DCGI, can we get certain relaxations? And what are those conditions under which the DCGI and the CDSO can give those relaxations? Now, that could be in terms of some data, in terms of full data relaxation, in terms of certain tests, it could mean anything, depending on whether it is a life-threatening or a serious disease condition. It's a rare disease where you may not have enough data. Disease of special relevance to Indian scenario or unmet, like tuberculosis, for example, which are very local to us, or an unmet medical need in India, or a disaster like a COVID or something like that, which could, help us, which would be important from an Indian point of view. So these are some of the considerations that DCGI will consider, but it will be depending on a case to case basis, not that it has to be by right. They will look at each case separately, but there is a possibility. And a lot of new drugs, some of these drugs have come in which were in rare diseases or which are in diseases where there are no treatments. They have been allowed to be approved in India with caveat or with a recommendation that there will be data generated post marketing so that at least patients do get this drug, and then data has to be generated to understand how it fares in the Indian population. So that's what consideration of fair to case basis means. Now, there was this question on what is this post-trial access can we have? So I know Dr. Prasanna did allude to this, but I would specifically say when we make an application to the DCGI, and a lot of companies don't agree with this, there is a declaration which we have to give before, at the time of making an application to the DCGI, that post-trial access will be provided. It's a requirement and it is a law. It's in the drugs and costs. It's in our city rules now. So first, let's try to understand what it means. A post-trial access means making a new drug or an investigational new drug available to a trial subject after completion of clinical trial through which the said drug has been found beneficial to the trial subject during the clinical trial for such a period as considered necessary by the investigator and the ethics committee. So it is the investigator and the ethics committee that will determine how long this should be given, provided that it is beneficial to the trial subject. So that's post-trial access. Because while sitting in ethics committees, we take it generally, post-trial access has to be given, but it has to be given for a new drug available. Now I will define what are the conditions under which this can be given. And this is important. Conditions for post-trial access. Post-trial access of investigational drug to be provided by the sponsor to the trial subject free of cost, provided that, number one, the clinical trial is conducted for an indication for which no alternative therapy is available. If I'm doing a trial in hypertension, another product, and they say that, oh, my patient is benefiting, so he should be post-trial, access should be granted. The answer is no, because there are so many therapies available already in the market. So which means there is no known treatment for that drug. Then only this clause gets effective. Okay, it's important. The subject and the legal here has consented in writing to use post-trial investigational drug. Obviously, they have to take consent. And the investigator has certified that the trial subject or the legal here has declared in writing that the sponsor shall have no liability for post-trial use of the new drug. So which means now if Vitress is coming out with a new drug and which is for an indication where there is no alternative treatment available and that some patients are benefiting out of this. Now the trial comes to an end, what happens to the patients? So the investigator and the ethics committee may recommend treatment for this post-trial access to this. The sponsor has to agree. They have to agree because it's a law, but they will make an application to the CDSCO. CDSCO will finally determine. It can't be done at, just the ethics committee and all, because it's access. This is still investigational drug. It is not marketed. So sponsor, when I, as a patient, am taking this drug and something happens tomorrow, you can't blame the sponsor for that because I'm taking your drug because it's not yet marketed. So that is the declaration that sponsors shall have no liability. So we are providing. Now, a lot of sponsors try to continue and help patients through compassionate use. Again, as an investigational drug, certain trials are run. So there are multiple ways, but this rule is very clear. I recently did 2 of such. patients who were needing this. And, we had to go to the CDSU and get approval for this. So it is possible, but under these conditions. It is not a guaranteed thing that it has to happen, and it cannot be for an indication where treatments are already available, indicated for that. Like, for example, if I am giving a DMD, for example, now we don't have a treatment for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And if I'm doing a trial and this drug works, for example, and so current treatment, current therapy for DMD is nothing but steroids. So steroid is not an indicated treatment. It is used as a surrogate treatment for them because we don't have anything else. So steroids will not be considered as the treatment. So for this, it would apply if the patient is doing well. This drug should be provided to the patient under these conditions. So I will just talk about, my presentation is coming to an end. I will talk about some of the new things that were amended in the new in December, till December of 2022. So not many, only one clarification on new drug definition. I've only put out what is important. There are a lot of changes which is related to manufacturing, other things and administrative changes, but I took out points which are important from research point of view. There is a clarification on the new drug definition. So a new drug definition, there are multiple definitions. There is a number 5 definition, which is about a vaccine, a recombinant rDNA product, living modified organisms, monoclonal antibodies. Previously, it was stem cell derived products. Now they have put in cell or stem cell derived products. So that is the change which is I have underlined. That is the modification. So definition of this, a gene therapy product and all. So these all fall under new drugs. So any cell-based treatment, which may not necessarily be stem cell derived, but cell or stem cell derived products will fall into. That's one change. They've also defined the bioequivalent study center. It was not defined previously because bioequivalent centers are either clinical centers or labs where you have bioanalytical testing. So they have defined it that bioequivalent center would mean both, where you have clinical part or an analytical part, or where you have both will be considered as a bioequivalent center. And then they have put in what I mentioned earlier on, certain new forms, because again, the issue which came from the applicants, the industry at large, that we are not getting responses for quite some time, for days together. We don't get hear back on our applications and we are just stuck. So the drugs laws, the CT rules was changed, saying that if you don't hear back from CDSCO within a certain period of time, typically 30, 60, and 90 for different types of applications, it would be considered as deemed approval. As I mentioned in the beginning, deemed approval, so they created certain forms, which I said 4A was already there, but they added 6A and 7A forms, which is from a research point of view. I'll talk about those forms, saying that if you don't hear back, then you need to communicate to the DCGI that we have not received anything and we are initiating the study. So the information of initiation, notification of initiation within these forms has to be provided to this. So a lot of these changes were done in the amendments. And some of these forms I'm just mentioning, Form 2A is information to intimate the functioning of ethics committee. Like, for example, we want to change the certain things in the ethics committee and we have submitted to them, but we haven't heard back. What do we do? So they have defined that in the new amendments. Similarly, Form 6A, information to initiate clinical trial of a new drug. 7A, information to initiate bioavailability or bioequivalence study. And then some of the manufacturing parts. So these are some of the new changes that have come in. And then, the new drugs and clinical trial rule 2019, it will be called, but amendments keep on coming in. But as of today, what we discussed from a research point of view is what the drug laws in our country are as far as research studies are concerned. So I think I'm done with my presentation. I'll be glad to take questions, maybe now or at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the detailed presentation. And I know a lot of questions are there in our mind. I think I had one question. You had mentioned that the CTRI registration, I know for academics we do it, but the global clinical trials already they would have done with the CTRI. So do you think still we have to do it again?
No, as I said, see, if global trials are, see, global trials will have been registered if it's a global trial and we are doing it in India as a
Yes.
part of the global center, we also have to register in the CTRI, even if it is registered in other clinical trial registries like the clinicaltrials.gov. It has to be registered in India. Any trial that runs in India has to be in CTRI, be it global, be it local.
And one more question was you had mentioned that if most of the if any institution doesn't have their ethics committee and they can present in our committee, and you said it's within the same city or within 50-kilometer radius. In case it's some,
Correct.
how do we do the auditing process? Like how do we evaluate they are following the protocols and there's no violations? Because whatever happens in our institute, we know what happens. But the other place, how do we monitor that? Is there any
That's
protocol?
correct. See, it's the when we talk about, there are two or three things in when we talk about other centers, for example, which we are. So first of all, if the ethics committee feels that we cannot cover that center, then we should not allow that. It is institutional, let us restrict to institutional. Now, there are ways to look at it. As long as it is, let's say, Bangalore, we talk about 50-kilometer radius anywhere. Shankara's ethics committee, and then there is another clinic which is in Jayanagar, they want to follow it. Now, before I would actually do that as ethics committee, I want to make sure as an ethics committee that whatever trial they want to do they have the facility? So I think first and foremost is go to that place and have a look at what their facilities are, whether they qualify as a center in the first place, number one. Number two is, see, when we look at oversight of what is oversight, oversight says, which I think Dr. Prasanna mentioned, that at least once a year. Now, once a year oversight would mean there are different mechanisms of oversight. When you give an ethics committee approval letter, you define it that in that you say that I want to know the update of the study with every 3 months, every 6 months, depending on the type of trial. If I'm doing a phase one, I might want it every 1 month, or every patient that is recruited, I need to know what has happened if it's a phase one, as an example. So you can put certain clauses in the study and then ask them to present, because that's how oversight is. Every time you may not go physically and audit it. Now we do go every 6 months, like we do follow at Aster. We go every 6 months and actually pick up studies and go to the centers and see, look at data, look at ethics committees, look at SEs, look at everything. So the same thing can be done in these institutions as well. So there are mechanisms, or you tell the investigator to make the presentation every month, every 2 months, depending on what type of trial you are doing. So that's the only way. It's not necessary that you go physically every time.
I think Dr. Kavita had the same question. Dr. Kavita, you want to ask anything else regarding the same? Anybody else has any questions?
I think maybe some might have come in the chat box, but if there is any other question now, we can address it. Or
I think one question Dr. Kaushik had, I think Dr. Prasanna Ganapati has answered the question.
okay.
Anybody else has any questions, please? I think somebody else has. Okay, I think Dr. Kavita is not able to unmute. Tejaswini, can you please unmute her?
Yeah, I've done that, ma'am. Now she'll be able to do it herself.
Kavita, you can do, yeah, you can ask your.
Yeah, thank you for that elaborate brief on our doubts. Actually, we had 2 or 3 times these outside studies request. So we really
Right.
didn't know how to go about it. Although the ICMR guidelines are clear cut that we need to have a MOU with the outside institute.
Correct.
But then, as you said, sir, we may not really know how well they are doing or how to reject it or, disapprove the studies as well. So I think now we need to be very frank. That's what you told us.
Correct. That's the best thing, because ultimately, why would we take liability for something which we are not comfortable with or we are not confident with? So it's important that we go and see the place first, that, oh, this is an institution and they have all the facilities, and then the type of trial also. Um, what kind of trial it is. Say, if it is the least risk is, if it is an observational study, there is nothing much in it, the risks are minimal. Well, you can go about it, you can do it. There's no problem. So the risks are minimum. So it all depends on what kind of a study you are evaluating. And you can go by an MOU, that is for studies, or sometimes if there's a written application which comes from that institution saying that, or that clinic or that investigator, then the ethics committee will respond that whether we will or whether we will not take that also is fine. It may not necessarily be an MOU, but both ways are open as long as documentation is done and coverage is covered, by the ethics committee. So again, it's a risk-based thing, what type of study you are looking at. If I'm
Thank you,
doing an
sir. Thank you very
observational
much.
study for 10 centers and there is not much, it is no intervention and all. So you could actually go with that. So it would have least risk, uh, in that sense. So that's where we have to evaluate what we should accept and what we should not accept as easy.
Can I ask one more question, sir?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, normally we do have some students coming out with prototype instruments.
Correct.
How do you validate them? Is a pilot study of
Uh,
certain number is sufficient? That is one, because we often face the dilemma.
Right. So let me answer that. Now, prototype instruments will fall under the category of medical devices. It depends on what kind of a device we're talking about. So if that device, if a similar device is already, because it's again, because sometimes as students or as investigators, whether it's a student or a doctor or an investigator, we have to figure out first whether it needs approval by the DCJ or not. Because it's always good to be compliant, because if it is an interventional device that you are using, which is a new device which is not known before, so there is it's always better to find out, and even if it is academic, you might need to go and notify and get an answer from them, wait for 30 days and then be there. We run the same in Aster. I got multiple devices. I said, let's apply, and then if we don't hear back, 30 days, wait. Better to be safe, because devices are very different depending on what outcomes we are looking at from that study, and try to do it, because sometimes in surgery you might use a small kind of device which is very, very specific to the patient. If it is an individualized device for that particular patient, you are safe. But if you're doing it for a group of patients, then it is an intervention that you are trying to do with a large set of patients. So that is where you have to, ethics committee approval by default, you have to take, no questions. But I think you have to be very clear on where this device or what that intervention you are doing has an implication, whether I need to go to the DCJ or not. Preference is always to err on the side of caution. Make an application, wait, you don't hear, start. If you have waited for this device to be developed for so many, you can do a pilot. So that's how you validate it. So best is to do that. I have informed and I am doing it, because you're not using it for any other point. Because then you will follow. If you get positive results, then you might do a better study. Because and typically what happens is these devices are done by somebody else. Some maybe, sometimes we run with an institutional, with, let's say, Indian Institute of Science scientists are working together and we come up with a device. So it is two institutions doing it, but I think it's important that we follow the law of the land and make an application to the DCGI, saying we want to do this as a validation study.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. One more just a question is, after waiting for 30 days, we can go ahead. That is what you said.
Yeah, you need to inform them only. That's the new amendment.
Communication. It's only about communication.
Communication.
And
amendment in the
study,
particular form. Yes.
And the pilot study, assume we have done a pilot study, does it need to be published? Or
that's
just
up to you. Publication is not a problem. It's up to you. Ethics committee doesn't tell you whether you should publish or not. Yeah, just publication is your choice. As long as you do it as per the standards of GCP.
But presenting to the ethics committee is important. The pilot
absolutely,
study.
Absolutely, no questions. Because a lot of times we do say that, even sometimes students come in saying that I have done this, Now I want to present to the ethics committee. No ethics committee generator can give a retrospective approval for a study. Even when you are looking at retrospective data, for example. So best is, see, retrospective data you are choosing for a study based on certain elements. You define a study on that. There is a protocol or there is a pro forma how you are going to do it. That is your study design. So you present it to the ethics committee. Ethics committee will say, okay, if there is nothing in this, it's minimal risk. You are doing retrospective data, de-identified, you can do that. But go to the ethics committee, because what happens is people come later on. Oh, we did everything. We went to the publication and they told us to get an approval now, whether you have got an ethics committee approval or not. Everyday story with me, believe me.
Yes, sir. We are also facing. We have to streamline. Thank
So
you, sir.
best is make it mandatory for any ethics committee, run out a notification to all the research people, to all the doctors in Shankara across, that any retrospective, prospective study for any reason. See, only thing is you see, sometimes there is this question, we say, oh, ethics, the minimal risk exemption from exempt. Now, what does exempt mean? Exempt doesn't mean that you don't go to the ethics committee. You have to make an application. Ethics committee will determine whether you need exemption from oversight over a period of time. Not that you don't have to go for an approval. So exempt is sometimes used in literal sense. Oh, I don't have to go. It is written in the laws. It is written in GCP and ICH or even ICMR guideline. Exempt. Exempt doesn't mean that you don't go to the ethics committee. You have to go to the ethics committee, seek an exemption that I'll do this one time. I don't have to, ethics committee doesn't have to follow that up. What happened, like we said, what is happening to the study, what is not happening to the study in 6 months, 3 months, or over a period of time. That's what it means.
Thank you, sir.
I think Vatsala ma'am has a question. Vatsala ma'am?
See, my question is related to the investigational drug. So, in the interest of the trial subject, I just wanted to know, should we add a clause in the sponsor's agreement that if the drug, as there is no alternative therapy available, if the drug used in the trial can be used even the post trial also, or should we add a clause in the sponsor's agreement with the sponsor that they should provide the drug to the trial subjects? Because maybe
whether you put it, okay, even if you don't put it in the, even if you do not put it in the agreement, it doesn't matter because the law is very clear. Because you have made an application through the DCGI, the law is very clear on that. You might want to put it in the agreement, but I would say that, from an operational point of view, no agreement has it, even if you put it, because then it might delay it. But you put it, it's okay. Even if you don't put it, the law is there. Law will take its action. Because anyway, at that time, you have to go, what I mentioned earlier on, you have to go to take ethics committee's permission, have to go to the CDSO, how long you will give it. Because as a pharma company, you can't give it for lifelong. So it means that, okay, the moment the drug is available in the market, it should not be given. It's logical, simple. Or as long as it is required, 3 cycles, 5 cycles, 6 cycles, whatever, depending on what type of drug we are talking about. So you can put it in the contract, but it's not mandatory.
so
It's okay.
if it is not available in the market, then we can insist on the sponsor to provide the drug if it is useful for the trial subject and in the interest of trial subject.
Correct. You can do it as long as there is no alternative therapy available.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Shantaya sir, you raised your hand. Any questions, sir? Anyone else has any questions? I think no more questions. Thank you so much, sir. If anybody has questions, please put in the chat box, so sir will be able to answer the question. Thank you, sir. So we'll
Thank you.
move on to the next talk by Dr. Animesh Jain. He'll be talking on ICMR guidelines, roles and responsibilities as EC member. So Dr. Animesh Jain is a professor of community medicine at Kasturba Medical College, Mangalore. And he's also the head of Mangalore Unit of International Chair in Bioethics. And he's a deputy coordinator for medical education unit for KMC Mangalore. And he has a lot of awards to his credit, and he's been a part of this course for various, meetings. Over to you, Dr. Animesh.
Thank you, Dr. Minija. I hope I'm audible.
Yeah, you're audible. You're audible.
Okay, just give me a moment and I will project my slides and then you can confirm whether it's visible.
Dr. Sandeep, you have a question on composition of audit committee. I think Dr. Animesh will cover all that now.
Right, so we will just have a look at. So I hope my slides are visible now.
Yes, it's visible.
Right, so good afternoon. And I was here online 11:45 onwards listening to Dr. Surinder and the discussion that was happening. And I'm so happy that some of the things that I'm going to probably talk about are already covered. So I will skip those when it comes. I've tried modifying a few, including CTRI, but I've kept a few still to reinforce. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an overview of the ICMR guidelines. It's not going to be possible for me to give you everything about it within the time that has been allotted. However, I will touch on the basic and the most important. We have all known about principles of ethics, especially when it concerns clinical care. And of course, when it comes to research, these are the 4 cardinal principles which came from the Belmont, which was in response to the Tuskegee trial. That is autonomy, beneficence and non-maleficence, and justice. We've all known this. Now, autonomy is basically we respect the wishes and the study participants' decision are the ones which are taken into account instead of we enforcing our views rather than being paternalistic, that is. And we do this by means of informed consent. And the word says informed, so that means we inform people and let them decide for themselves. Similarly, beneficence is doing good and non-maleficence is doing no harm or at least minimizing the harm. And then justice being fair in recruiting our participants as well as being fair when we want to give them the benefits that we derive out of research. So this has been there. Now, how does ICMR differ? So what ICMR did was ICMR came out with its new set of guidelines that we are discussing today in 2017, October 2017 to be precise. Okay, and this is 6 years now almost because 12th October they were launched. So this is available as a PDF document, and I would really strongly advise that everybody actually accesses this and then keeps a copy of this readily available for them to refer. It's not required to keep a hard copy. In case you wish to, you can print it out. I would not really suggest that you need to buy it because though it's available for a 500 rupee, but this is good enough, so PDF. Now, please remember any research that we do, and especially in the academic setting, that definitely I would advise you to go through these guidelines and follow this in letter and spirit, because this encompasses a whole lot of things. And this has actually, as Dr. Soumya Swaminathan put it, now this is the first time we have some guidance which is available, whether it is about public health research, social behavioral research, or research about vulnerable population, international collaborations, or even something like disaster and emergency related research. So all that is covered here. And the beauty of this is that we have it very systematically. Now I'll come to that why I'm saying that. But again, to answer, and I think this will reinforce the point that we were discussing a few minutes back in response to one of the query. So ICMR guidelines as such apply to all biomedical, social, and behavioral science research, which is conducted for health in India. Now, it doesn't stop there. Now, we all understand that if I am involving a human participant, I'm supposed to take into account these guidelines and I'm supposed to follow it. However, if you see the last bit, it's not just human participants, they're biological material and data. Why I'm emphasizing on this part is, now suppose I say that I have some tissue sample, I have some fluid sample or anything that I have had collected for something earlier, and I want to do some research on this, we need to follow the guidelines. Now, when I'm talking about, I go to the MRD, Medical Records Department, I pick up a few files, and I want to do some research on that. It's a retrospective analysis of some record which is already existing with me. So this guidelines applies to it. So that means I need to go to the ethics committee, follow the appropriate ethical guidelines, and then I need to take an approval. As Dr. Kher already put it, it's not the prerogative of me as a researcher or an investigator to decide whether this falls under exempt or whether it is expedited. I can request for it, but it's finally the ethics committee which decides, and that's the word which is final. I hope that comes clear. So as I said, it's not just human participants. including anything which is to do with their any kind of samples, biological material or data. And this again, they further say that when we do such a research, we should also be mindful of the context that we have here. So we have to maintain sensitivity to Indian cultural, social, and natural environment. Why this again gains importance is, see, sometimes some things which work in some other settings may not work here. Similarly, our cultural context and cultural sensitivity is different from the Western context. Certain things are, very culture specific. And please remember, if you go through the evolution of ethics, you will find that a lot of it is actually intertwined with culture, and also the evolution has happened and it is mindful of the culture. So that's why certain things which are acceptable in some cultures may not be acceptable elsewhere, and we have to be mindful of that. Now, very importantly, SIOMs and other guidelines also talk about it. The ICMR guidelines also says that we cannot wrong even one person for the benefit of a large mankind or society. So what they say is no person or persons become a mere means for the betterment of others, and we have to ensure that. So we should do research in such a way that we have to uphold the dignity and well-being of everybody, and there has to be a fair treatment and transparency of the whole thing. It's also important that when I do research, I'm accountable, I'm transparent. So ethics committee also has, that's why the purview or the jurisdiction to actually question or query and even monitor and then follow it up. So it says that subjected to a regime. So when I do research, it should be subjected to a regime of evolution at all stages. What do I mean? So when I'm doing the research, first I apply as a protocol. Now I start my study. So ethics committee can actually ask me for, and I should be open to queries, and I should be open to giving them updates, or they can have a site visit or whatever deemed fit. So that is there. And even when I'm conducting or even reporting, and if there is any question or something, so that should be, I should be transparent to that. So these are some things. Now the ICMR guidelines are laid in 12 sections. Each is serially numbered, and each of them have further subsections. So suppose if I'm talking about, say, 2 to 2.1, 2.2, and some of the cases it will be 2.2.1. So what it does is, the moment I say that I'm coming or I'm talking about 3.2.5, you and I are on the same page. They've also done one more thing. Compared to the previous guidelines, they of course improved, but they've added 2 new sections. One is section 3 on responsible conduct of research, and section 9 on social behavioral research, which hardly had any mention in many of the other guidelines earlier. And the beauty of it is, it's very nicely and neatly laid with a lot of tables and boxes. Now, what it does is, if I have already gone through and if I just want to brush up my memory, I want to quickly recapitulate, I can just go to a box and then just see something, and then I'll be immediately remembering, or it's a very quick reference. I'll show you some of the boxes. This is the content I'm just showing you, just a highlight. So let's see, if you see, it's serially numbered and sequentially subsections are there. So this is how it is organized, right? Now let's look into the guidelines. So it gives us 12 principles. We talked of 4 which we knew, but ICMR has expanded and rehashed them into 12 principles. Some of them are derived from what is already there or combination of them, and we will quickly look into these. So the first is principle of essentiality, and from there onwards it goes on, and the last one is the environmental protection. We'll go through these quickly. So principle of essentiality, what does it mean? So in the first place, when I want to do a research and I say that I want to take a human participant or human data, so I need to have a justification. And the ethics committee should look into it, that why is that we require participants as humans. And again, if I'm further specifying that a particular category or a group of participants, suppose I say pediatric age group, or I say elderly age group, or I say young people in the range of say 25 to 40 or whatever. So why is it for that particular group? That has to be justified. And is it not possible to do it on some other people or some other alternative? Once I justify in my proposal, it's not the end. The ethics committee has to look into it with the diverse group of participants, diverse group of members that it has, and they will consider from different angles, and they say, okay, this is fair and this is okay, and ethically there are no issues, so go ahead. So it has to be duly vetted and approved by the ethics committee. The next principle is of voluntariness. So we have to ensure that the participants are voluntarily taking part into a research. And this is ensured again by the means of informed consent. So we have to ensure that the informed consent is properly administered. It's a process rather than just a formality or documentation purpose. So we need to do that, and we need to inform participants about what they are getting into, what is it that they are entitled to, what are the possible foreseeable risk or any kind of harm that can be happening. And then with all that, they should be allowed to decide for themselves rather than being forced or coaxed into it. Next comes the principle of non-exploitation. So we have to be fair and equitable in our selection. At the same time, we have to have protection meant for the vulnerable. If at all I'm using, or subjecting any vulnerable population, and I have a few slides on that, so I'll come to that more later in discussion, in detail. But we have to see to it that we don't exploit. And that's where the first thing we said, that they should not become a mere means for the betterment for others. Similarly, we also have a social responsibility. As a part of society, we are a responsible societal members. So we have to see to it that we are sensitive to the harmony of the people in the community. And our research should not in some way disturb it. For example, if I take up something, and sometimes what we do is, I'll give you a simple example. Sometimes when we collect demographic data. So we collect age, gender, and religion, and things like that. Now what happens is, now I've collected. I want to analyze, so I feed this data into the computer, and then computer gives me out. And we know the principle of GIGO, that is garbage in, garbage out. So sometimes I will get, various things and associations. Now what happens is, suppose certain things, actually there is no basis or there is no possibility that there is an association in actual. But when I fed in data that demographic, it will give me associations. It is also possible it may give me gender related or maybe even religion related. Now it is possible that just because my participants come from an area, the distribution of the religion happened to be in that way, and that's why I got that. So it may not be true, and that may sometimes lead to some disharmony. So we need to be mindful of these things as well and are responsible. We also are supposed to uphold the privacy and confidentiality. Privacy, very simply put, it's the right of an individual to decide what they want to disclose or part with, or how much to what extent. Once that happens, and once the research team or the investigator is aware, has the information, it is the obligation on the part of the researcher and the investigator and his or her team to maintain that sacrosanct only with them, not to indiscriminately go around and expose it. It should be only accessible to research team. It should be, in case we are doing it digitally, then it should be accessible with passwords and in secure servers. If it's a physical, then somebody who has the access to the key or wherever it is kept, only authorized people should have access. So confidentiality pertains to once I have an access, I do not indiscriminately go around just going to share it with everybody, only with certain people who are supposed to know it. Next is risk minimization. Now, again, as I said, whatever we do, we should try and minimize the risk. And if at all we see a possibility of any kind of harm, we have to think of what kind of way we can help them, even sometimes, and death definitely requires a financial compensation. And it's not just the responsibility of a researcher, but it's all the stakeholders, which includes the participant as well, because they need to follow the guidelines that we have told or whatever instructions we've given. It's also the responsibility of ethics committee. So if you're sitting in ethics committee, you should see, are there any possibilities or we have overlooked or the researchers have not thought about, so how it can pose a risk. And we will see how risk is classified also. Then in hand it goes maximization of benefit. So we need to see to it that whatever we do, we try to maximize the benefit, not just to the participants, even at the level of society at large. So that is something which we have to look at, because when the research is done, how is it going to benefit the large number of people? And whenever a research is done, it should be done by people who have the requisite experience and the qualification. So people who are doing research should be qualified. For example, now I come from community medicine. I cannot be a lead researcher when it comes to a study maybe in ophthalmology or maybe in a cardiovascular domain. But I can be a part of the team. Why? Because I have my own abilities. I am good at probably, designing a tool or a questionnaire, or I can help in designing the protocol, the methodology streamlining, or maybe data analysis. Yes, but I cannot be the lead person. But when it comes to, if you want to look at epidemiology of some eye disease, I can be the lead researcher because epidemiology becomes my domain. So I hope you got the idea. Now, some of you might think that, okay, what happens then in the case of trainees like, postgraduates or fellows? So in that case, it's one of the things which is a requirement, partial fulfillment for their course or degree. So there again, they are supervised. They're working under a guide or a supervisor. So in that case, the situation is different. And that's why, again, the responsibility is also of the guide or the supervisor. And they are doing it under supervision. Principle of institutional arrangement says that there should be appropriate facilitation from the institution, because most of the time institutions are also involved in, the people who are doing research are part of some institution. So there should be a mechanism of governance, a research governance mechanism, which takes into account multiple things, and there should be an adequate infrastructure which is provided or it's available. And that's why sir was saying that, when you do, and you should visit and then see that whether there are facilities available. At the same time, there are manpower which will, I cannot do something without having manpower if I require that. And then the funds. And if there is a grant which is coming in, there should be a appropriate mechanism to manage those funds, because sometimes we doctors, especially, or healthcare professionals, are not good at managing it. So we need to have a system in place. It could be our finance section or somebody who's supporting. And then, there are a lot of requirements, including something like audits and statements to be provided at regular intervals to the funding bodies. So all that has to be in place. And also to build capacity and sensitize people. So training opportunities like this is very important. Next is transparency and accountability. So we have to make sure that whatever we do, we are responsible, we are accountable, and there is transparency. That includes, when I do research, I should actually present it, publish it, because then it becomes open to everybody and we are sharing. So that's important as well. And also, when I do research, I need to keep the data and records for a requisite period. Safely, it would be a good idea to keep at least for 5 years, but there could be up to 15 years you may require to do it. But generally for 5 years, you must keep it, because in case there is a question asked, and so most of the time, you can always fall back and look into it. That's required. Principle of totality of responsibility. So here, it's not just the person who's doing research, but everybody, all the stakeholders are responsible. And all kinds of people who are involved, including, I would say, as I said, participants who are involved, they have to follow things. So that's why totality of responsibility. At the same time, when we are doing, it's not my professional responsibility or obligation, but even my social and moral responsibilities which are binding to. So that's important. And lastly, since we are moving towards being green, I need to be mindful of the environment and the harm that we may cause by doing our actions. So I need to try and have processes which will be more environment friendly, which includes having, like CRFs as electronic, and even, processes which are electronic, provided I have mechanisms and I can keep it secure. So that's about the 12 principles. As I said, there are principles which some of those are extrapolation of some of those principles earlier, but that's how ICMR talks about. Now, it's important for us, both from the point of view of researcher as well as ethics committee members, to be aware of these, so that when you review protocols, you are aware. So, the general issues I want to touch on some of these. So benefit risk. So always look at, see, any research, including something which sounds very simple, innocuous, will have some kind of a risk. Sometimes even a simple thing like, I want to ask a few questions to somebody might put somebody who's in an emotional state, or maybe is already traumatized, or maybe had a bereavement, could be actually breaking down. So that could be emotional, stress. So we need to be mindful. And that's why when I do research, I should always look at these, and always my benefit should outweigh the risk. So that's important. And as an EC member, it's our duty to look at the proposals and see that, yes, this is, and this is required. This has more potential benefits. How am I looking at it? And then if at all, if the thing is continuing, is there a possibility that there may be altered risk which comes up in the future? So if so, AC should be looking at those, and then, at the continuing time of review, they should look at and then probably ask for, or if required, they can even, ask for modification or required halt that. This is how the risk is quantified. As per ICMR, this is how they say that, it is classified. So the first one is less than minimal. That means, as we say, we are not expecting any kind of harm or risk. Okay, no discomfort is expected. But the next one is minimal. So in our day-to-day lives, we may be, encountering some kind of risk or some kind of potential harm which may happen in our day-to-day lives, not necessarily when I participate as a participant in this. So if by participating in a research, if my risk happens to be similar to my routine life, that's minimal risk. So if I have minimal, there is something which is more than minimal, that is minor increase over minimal. In other words, that's also termed as low risk. So what is this low risk? So if I feel that there is an increased harm possibility, little more than what I said in routine life, that falls under low risk. Please remember, such research, when we do, it should have a social value. Most of the times, things like psychological harm, social risk, any discomfort falls under this category. Now, if I have a low risk, obviously I have to have another category, which is high risk. So anything which is more than minimal falls under high risk. And in this, the probability of harm or discomfort which we anticipate in the research is greater than minimal. It could be invasive kind of a thing. It could be interventional study. All this falls under this. So we have, these categories: less than minimal, minimal, low risk, and high risk. Now, please remember, when we talk of harm, so research can result in multiple harms. One is, when we say harm, we think of physical only, but it could be psychological, it could be social, it could be even sometimes legal. Why? Because I did something and that led to certain kind of maybe disfigurement, and that person happened to be a celebrity, will also sue me. So, so many kind of things could be there. And we need to look at all these things. And then as an ethics committee, that's why when you have a multidimensional composition, everything is looked into. And if at all there's a harm which happens, there has to be a compensation given. And in case of death, definitely a financial compensation. In case of others, we can think of, even mitigating it in different ways, not necessarily always financial, but death definitely entitled to financial compensation. Now, we also try and look at, when we propose research or when we are building in a proposal, we should try to look at or foresee what are the risks or harms involved. And in that case, we should also try and mitigate these by having inbuilt provision with foresight, so that we can try and minimize this harm as well. Now, in case something happens and which is classified as a serious adverse event, that means either a death or maybe a disability or a permanent residual disability, maybe requiring a hospitalization or a prolonged stay in hospital, all this falls under that ambit. So any SAE, serious adverse event, has to be reported to the ethics committee, irrespective of a holiday, within 24 hours. And this has to be brought to the knowledge. Once that is done, we also need to look into and then inquire and generate a report, and that has to be done about whether this SAE was related to research or not. And this has to be done within a time frame of 14 days. So once that is done, now IEC will look into and then we will review whether this relatedness is there or not. So was that serious adverse event related to research that is being done, and that participant being a part of this. Based on that, they will also decide on the quantum and type of assistance. And when they do that, they will look into multiple aspects, including whether it was a regulatory trial or a non-regulatory research, what type of injury which has happened, what type of research was it? Was it only observational? Was it interventional? Is it a temporary or permanent disability? Or is it short-term or long-term? Has that resulted in some other financial hardships, loss of wages, etc.? So this all has to be taken into account. Now, any adverse event, whether related or not, should be offered appropriate medical care, because we all come from the healthcare this thing. So we have to see to it that we offer them support, psychosocial support, even when required, referrals to appropriate. Because if I'm a specialized hospital and I don't have facilities, at least a referral and clinical facilities have to be provided. Goes without saying that till we establish and all, at least medical management should be free and compensation should be given if we can establish that the harm was related to research. A compensation, if I am doing a sponsored research, if I'm doing something like a regulatory or it's a sponsored trial, it's very simple. Sponsor is responsible for compensation. I think that we have established, and I would have got that impression because we were talking some things in the discussion in the previous session. However, the next thing is important. Now, if I am doing it in a setting of an academy, so or if I'm doing as my own research, so investigator-initiated research or a student research, the investigator or the institution becomes responsible. Now, this is important for all of us to understand. Now, ICMR guidelines have very clearly stated this, and this is something which has been a bone of contention. Because in this case, now, if my postgraduate does a research, my institution is liable, and he or she, whatever does, and then something goes wrong, institution becomes also responsible. So responsibility of the host institution, which will provide compensation or cover for insurance. This is what the ICMR guidelines say. And if at all there is a research-related injury, this has to be paid. Now, this has become a problem because most of the institutions don't want to absorb this or take this responsibility. And that's why many of these researches now are not being done as what earlier we were trying out, even for dissertations or things like that, where we were trying to look at interventional studies or trials. In fact, further ICMR guidelines say that we should create inbuilt mechanisms to be able to provide compensation. And even they say that we can probably think of looking at establishing or maintaining a corpus fund. Easier said than done. Of course, our institution, Manipal Academy of Higher Education, is looking at it. Recently, we had some discussions, and then probably they're going to institute this. It's a good idea to look at it. Maybe even you can think of a portion of what is institutional overhead or something which come from clinical trials to put in and then make a bursary or a corpus fund. But you can also think of, though again most of the agencies don't do, but now things are changing, so you can try and budget for even insurance coverage or compensation for the grant proposals that you write. So that's a good idea. Another thing is, I recently came across one of my colleagues in physiotherapy who's doing something for his PhD. So he has personally taken an insurance. It costed him, I think, about 20,000 rupees for 100 participants, because he's doing some interventional techniques for his physiotherapy, which is related to his PhD project. So he took it himself. So there are companies which provide you, but it's a good idea to probably even look at a larger this thing. If you're doing too many of these, so you can take it at a larger level, and you can get a group kind of a thing at a lesser price. Now, next is, can I use placebo? So placebo ideally is not recommended to be used nowadays, but ICMR says it may be used in certain cases. So if I don't have an established effective therapy for a particular condition, I can go ahead and use placebo. Or if I have a therapy, but if I withhold that established effective therapy, it's not going to expose participants to any serious harm. It will only cause probably a temporary discomfort, or maybe it will, for a period of time, delay the relief of symptoms. Then I can use it. Or in other times when my disease that I'm looking at is only going to resolve itself, so that means it's a self-limited illness, then I can use placebo. Or I have an established therapy, and if I'm using that established therapy as a comparator, it will not yield a scientifically reliable results, and use of placebo is not going to add any additional risk or serious harm. Then I can go ahead and use. But when I do that, I have to ensure that certain extra precautions are taken. So I must have some inbuilt additional safeguards which are there to protect my participants from harm. Okay, so I could give them clear-cut withdrawal criteria. I should have more intensive monitoring, or I also look at sometimes it required rescue medications to be provided. Further, they say when I do that, it's a good idea to actually have a comparison study. Okay, And if I'm looking at an investigational product, I could even have a randomization in such a way that investigational product, I have a 2:1 for placebo, that kind of a ratio. So I have a fewer patients who are exposed to placebo. I could even think of an active comparator. So what I do is I have an investigational product arm. I also have another active comparator arm. And again, in that ratio should be such that the 2 of investigational product, 2 of active comparator, and I have 1 of placebo. So again, I'm trying to minimize the placebo. Okay. And make sure that once we have, research is completed, so we ensure the transition to the standard care or active medicine for the participants who participated in this study. Now, this is again, some of you might be interested in this. So if I'm thinking of certain surgical interventions or modifications to that, so when I'm proposing a surgical intervention, ideally I should provide all the references for the procedure and what are the most anticipated likely complications. Each of these complications, what's the frequency, that should be mentioned so that the ethics committee can look into, and if required, they can take expert opinion as well. Now, if at all I'm planning to modify an existing surgical intervention, so in such a case, I should clearly specify why is this justified, why should I modify this? And if I do that, what are the expected complications? And in such a case, definitely it's advisable, it's preferable that we do a comparison. I should not just do one series and say that, see, these are the results. Instead of that, I do an existing thing and a modified. So 2 arms, and then I compare the results because that will give me a better and a more reliable and valid results. At the same time, if I'm coming out with a totally new surgical technique, I say that, okay, this is something which has not been there and I want. So when I do that, there should be some basis, and it's preferable that EC would ask for some animal data or a modeling data, which can at least give us some idea of the efficacy and safety of the technique. Or if it's possible that we have some case report or case series, present that, because then they will be in a better position to judge your protocol and give you approvals. Now, any adverse events again happening because of this kind of participation in any surgical intervention, that has to be reported to EC and the sponsor if required, or if it's applicable. And then it has to be done within the specified timelines, as I said. Provision of free treatment and compensation goes without saying that we have to provide if there is an injury which relates to the study. Next is the issue of privacy confidentiality. As I said, I've already mentioned this. So it's the right of the individual to decide how much information or we can part, he or she wants to part with, and who he or she wants to disclose it. Once that is done, it's the obligation on the part of the study team or the researcher and the investigator to protect that information and not allow it to be unauthorized used or accessed. Next comes the distributive justice. Now, when we do something, we have to ensure that there is fairness. We do not discriminate about societal say divisions or socioeconomic status or race or ethnicity, all these things. So we have to ensure that there is fairness when we recruit people. At the same time, when we are going to share the benefits once we have done with the research. So this is something which we have to ensure, and that's the principle of distributive justice. So that brings me to the next section on vulnerability. Now, vulnerability is a very interesting concept, and most of the time when I do it, especially on-site and physically, I usually generally try to get a pulse of the participants, and I ask them, who are the people vulnerable? And generally I get a response that, so-and-so, children, prisoners, homeless, or orphans, pregnant women, elderly, yes, all those are. But what I want to always emphasize is, see, vulnerability is contextual, it's context specific. Those are vulnerable because of their certain inherent traits or maybe limitations, but anybody can be vulnerable. You and I can be vulnerable as well, depending on what's at stake, what is it that I'm getting. So please remember that these are some things that we have to look at individually. Now, what makes people in case I'm thinking of vulnerability? So vulnerability comes from social, economic, even as political advantage or disadvantage. So that renders them exploitable and limits their ability to have a voluntary informed decision. Now, this may be temporary, it could be permanent. So that is something which we need to consider. And sometimes the people may be able to give consent, but voluntariness or understanding itself is not totally, say, existing in a way which we expect. So there is a compromise ability to understand, or voluntariness is compromise because they are under duress, or maybe they are under some kind of a hierarchical, say, setups. So they may have fear, they may have expectations of benefit, which clouds their judgment. So, or they may not decide to, refuse. So those things come into picture. When we want to select any vulnerable group, we have to keep certain things in mind. And this is from ethics committee also. You should think, if any group is selected, which may be vulnerable, why is it important to keep those groups involved? So because there is an additional harm which may happen. So they are not probably able to protect their rights. And that's why it's the duty of others to protect them. So what are these characteristics which may make people vulnerable? So legal status, like in case of children, because they have limited ability legally, they are not able to. So all those things come into picture. There are clinical conditions like where people are unconscious, or maybe they have cognitive impairment, so they are not able to take decisions, they are not able to comprehend things. Or sometimes people are socially disadvantaged or economically poor. So they are, again, a little constrained, or they can be influenced. So all those conditions, they make them vulnerable. So when we look at these, it's the responsibility of others, including the ethics committee, that we protect their interests and we don't compromise their position. Because these are some of the people who are vulnerable, which includes even sexual minorities and others, and people like children, women, all those. So when we look at these proposals, first of all, as a researcher, I should think of, but ethics committee definitely should look at that why this has been included. So they should be included in research only when the research is directly answering the health needs or requirement of the group, and they should be given equal rights. It's not that just because they happen to be from vulnerable section, so we do anything with them. And it is important duty of ethics committee to determine their vulnerability and ensure that there are safeguards and mechanisms in place which will protect them. It could have even things like more rigorous monitoring, more reporting, or maybe safeguards like giving them additional time or to take an opinion before they get into, and things like that, or even things like checking for their understanding and things like that. So simple things. Can we pay people for participating? So again, depends on if I have budget. But ideally, whatever said and done, please understand that we don't make people pay for participating. So if I'm planning to do certain tests or investigations or certain procedures, my participants should not pay just because I want them to do certain things for my research. If it's a routine thing, is a different thing, but related to my research, they should not be additional incurred expenditure on them. At the same time, I can pay them for certain things that they may lose. It can be in cash or kind or both. So if they come only for my sake and they are coming for follow-up 3 times, they're losing their wage, they are coming, transporting themselves, probably some refreshments. So all these things can be provided. Or I may say that, okay, just because you've been coming, so I will give you certain other benefits. So in Sankara Hospital, next 6 months, you will have free eye care. And these are restricted to these things, that's possible. Or you may give them an incentive of, say, maybe 200 rupees, and you say that, okay, but this should not be disproportionate. I can't say that every visit I will pay them 5,000 rupees. That becomes an inducement. And especially for a poor person, that might become that he or she may overlook the harms that may happen. Next is, very briefly, I'll touch on responsible conduct of research. Now this mainly is basically that, see, we have our role as a responsible member of society. Though we do research, or we are doing the benefit of science and things like that, but we have to keep in mind the sensitivity of the society and the cultural impact that it may bring. And it's also our role to make sure that the next generation gets the right messages. So mentoring, role modeling. So that's very important, because most of the times we learn by seeing others, and then sometimes we have wrong role models we will follow. So that's why it's a responsible conduct of research is very important. Otherwise, we might end up, things getting deteriorated. There are certain issues like conflict of interest. A conflict of interest basically means that I have multiple roles and I'm getting conflicted between those roles. Or I have a set of conditions and my primary interest happens to be something and that is getting unnecessarily or unduly influenced by secondary interest. To give you an example, when I take on or don the role of a researcher and I'm also a treating doctor or a surgeon or a physician, when I don the role of researcher, I need to see to it that I protect my participants. At the same time, I should not be governed by certain other motives or interests or my personal interests, taking that position into account because that's my official position. And that's not always financial, it could be personal. I might want to have a favor academic promotion, or I might want to climb up the ladder in my association, and I want to influence somebody, and then through that, I would gain some favors. So all these could be the things, not just necessarily financial. When we deal with conflict of interest, please remember that it's not wrong to have it, but what we need to do is we should not let that come into account, or we should not get influenced by it in our conduct of research. And also, it's a good idea to declare it in the proposals when we submit it. And also, if I'm in the ethics committee, I should look at these and decide based on that, and if required, get clarification. If I happen to be an ethics committee member and a proposal comes where I am also a part of it, then again I have a conflict of interest, because in my presence, the ethics committee members may not be able to probably discuss it in say maybe in a very dispassionate way. So I should step out. So there should be SOPs in place where I need to declare that I have a conflict of interest, and I step out, and then when the decision is made, I come back in. So then the discussion or the issues are conveyed, not just saying that XYZ said that, ABC said that, but it is the collective thing which is conveyed, and that's how it should be. There are some things which have been suggested by the ICMR guidelines about what can be done to mitigate the COIs, that is conflict of interest, at the level of research institution, at the level of researchers, and also at the level of ethics committees. So I'll not go into details again. We were discussing post-research access and benefit sharing. I'll give you a little further information and a little twist. So it's our responsibility as healthcare professionals to continue making the people that have participated in our research to support them. Just because my research is over, I should not withdraw. I should not, raise my hands and say, now done, over. So I need to continue that care and give better care and support. Now, sometimes it may not be possible for us to generally do everything, but what we can do is we can look at improving the health of the community, especially if you're doing some community-based research. And there are indirect ways of doing that. You can improve their living conditions. You can provide them educational support. You can give them awareness. You can provide some counseling centers or clinics or schools or things like that. Of course, some of these things, depending on what is feasible, but these are indirect way where we are going to improve their lives. So that can be thought of. And it's a good idea to come back and simplify and then share your findings, because that way we are priming them and then they become more conducive in future when we want to research. It's also our accountability that we are actually telling them what are the findings of the research that we did on them. So that's important as well. Now, it's a good idea again to describe these things in your study protocol itself, not wait till I will do and then. So an EC should look at these and then look at what are the arrangements. So when they review it, and this was already discussed. So if you're doing an investigational drug trial, so that should be given to the participant post trial and should be a MOU or some agreement to that. But make sure before you do that, there are regulatory approvals in place. And if you have certain studies, which are with restricted scope, like your student projects or your postgraduate dissertation, it's not possible or feasible for you probably to do so many things. But what should you do is you should try and make sure that at least give them some support and care and have a continuity of care. So there is a liaising, because that will also prime these people for your future interactions with these community, and they will be very much amenable to your interventions even in future. Now, quickly to touch on, because I already heard certain discussions on CTRI. So CTRI has been in existence for quite some time, but over recent time only we have started becoming a little more aware and utilizing it. So it's been there from 2007. It's a collaboration between WHO, ICMR. One important thing is earlier we could have registered, before 2018, we could have registered anything, anytime, even if my trial was over or it was ongoing, we could have. But now, 2018 April onwards, when I want to register, I should not have started enrolling my first participant. So you need to upload all the things, including the ethics committee approval letter, and then wait for the CTRI number to come in and then start enrolling. So that's important. This is the website, ctri.nic.in. Quickly to tell you, some people say that, okay, I'm doing only an observational study. Shall I register it? Is it required? So please understand, any interventional study, and I emphasize interventional or any clinical trial must. Interventional, yes, I would say, including any intervention which is in the educational intervention form. For example, you want to do an educational intervention for, say, maybe glaucoma. You say that I will use some flip charts, I will use some electronic methods or a WhatsApp videos. That's an intervention, educational intervention. You want to see, compare which are the better ones. So please register. But what WHO advises, if you are in doubt, register, no harm. But as I said, registers only prospectively. First enrollment should not happen. Now, what kind of studies? So anything, practically anything and everything. Interventional, observational, BAB, post-marketing, everything. Including from other systems of medicine, which includes traditional like Ayush, everything can be registered. Postgraduate thesis can be registered. So please make sure that you do that. And anything which involves human participants, any kind of thing, as I said, it improves transparency. Now, in fact, people looking at systematic reviews, they look into this database. In fact, if you want, like, you can look into what is being done in the area that you are proposing. You can go through that data and you can actually connect with people if you want. Now, another question was, my thing is already registered elsewhere. So please remember, the idea is to have Indian specific data, and that's why we need to register all trials done in India on CTRI, because CTRI is specific to India, and that's the specific Indian arm of trial, the data we will get. Now, I already have a multi-centric thing. There's a primary registration number. So what you do is, when you put it for registration, there is a secondary ID section in CTRI. Put that primary registration number, automatically it gets linked. It will become identified as a single trial, but it will still maintain that India specific. So this is again to reinforce what Dr. Surinder was saying. Now I switch to the second part of it, composition and functioning of IEC. So I will just give you the guidelines which ICMR talks about. Now ICMR says that ideally every institution should have an ethics committee, whichever is doing research, to facilitate and also look at things. Now they say we should have a varied composition, and then again they tell us who all should be there, but there should be at least one member whose primary area of expertise is a non-scientific area, a clinician, at least one member who is independent of the institution or research side. Okay, and then again they have given up various things. Now ideally I need to have 7 to 15 people. Okay, and 50% has to be external members. The chairperson is always an external. The secretary is always from the institution, because it needs to do a lot of liaising, paperwork, things like that. External member is always a chairperson. There is an option of having a co-chairperson in case you want to, even a joint secretary, optional. In case you have certain proposals which you do not have expertise in, as an ethics committee, you can even invite members who are experts, or even sometimes if you're doing on a particular, like say, rare disease, so you have organization of rare disease association, or so you can call a member from that. Now they will come, they will participate only in giving you their inputs. They don't participate in the decision making process. Okay, and they also need to have confidentiality agreement signed, because they should not disclose these things. And this is the composition, as I was telling you. So chairperson is always an external, member secretary is from inside, and then you have other people. and minimum of 7 to 15 members, and 50% of this has to be external. So if you have 15, it has to be 8 members who are external. Now, out of these, for a valid IEC to decide, quorum is minimum 5 members. That 5 actually consist of people who are going to be there, including preferably a chairperson and a layman, and and then if you see, these are the people who are there, including who are the people or what is their qualification. So a chairperson should be a well-respected person from any background with prior experience of having served. So we don't make anybody a chairperson without any experience. So those things are there. So these are the people. And again, we have other things like, we have other committees like stem cell research committees and things like that, for which guidelines vary a little. Now, quorum is, as I said, 5. Now, this includes both medical and non-medical. And one non-affiliated member should be definitely part of a quorum minimum, and a lay person should preferably be a part of the quorum. So these are some things which you should remember. Okay. Now, when you review all research proposals, please think of these guidelines, and you can even ask questions or things about the scientific process or the methodology. It's not out of the purview. So any ethics committee being questioned that why are you asking? So it comes within your purview. And also let me remind you, bad science is bad ethics. So if at all, even if it's gone through the scientific review, and if the ethics committee or any of the members feel something or query, they can ask, and that has to be appropriately answered by the investigator or the investigation team, right? Of course, I think SOPs and all those and things you are aware of. When you review proposals, you need to remember these things. So look at what is the social value of the work. Is the scientific design and the conduct of study properly laid out? Is it scientifically sound? Is it valid? Is it appropriate for the question that is being answered or addressed? The objectives being raised? And then look at the benefit risk assessment. As I said, benefit should always outweigh the risk. How are the participants being selected and recruited? Is there a mechanism in place? Is it strong enough? Is it, having provisions for protection with privacy and confidentiality? Are the participants being paid in kind or cash or any way? And what are the community considerations? How is the informed consent process? Is it strong enough? Is it and have they written about things? Is there a proper method? Is there any conflict of interest? If so, is it disclosed? And are the researchers qualified enough? Is the site adequate, as sir was saying, that you inspect? And if at all something goes wrong, what are the plans for medical management and compensation? And in case you're taking proposals from the nearby sites or something, as you said, those where they don't have an ethics committee, it is advisable for 2 things in my personal experience. One, you can think of a MOU that makes it easier for you and lay down things, and then what can be taken and what are the mechanisms and things like that. So if you have a MOU, which is a document, then it becomes easier to access. Second is, many times it's proposed that you might involve and say that, okay, one of the person from our group will, your institution will be part of that proposal. So you get access. It's easier access because he or she will be in the loop. They should keep that person in the loop. Then that becomes easier. When you review, chairperson and member secretary may have a dual role. So if it happens to be a pharmacologist or somebody, so they can play that role as well. You may think of alternate members, because in sometimes, if you don't have the quorum, then you may not have a meeting. So in certain cities like Bangalore or metros like Mumbai, you may have to have alternate members, but put that in paper beforehand. You can't say, today I don't have the legal expert, my legal expert coming, I will call that person today and then he will come. No, it's not arbitrarily and random like that. So it has to be already planned for. Alternate members are these. In case the regular members express their inability to join the meeting on that day, you already must inform the alternate members. They should be available so that your quorum is complete. You may think of even keeping subject experts if you have certain areas where you get proposals. So you can have those and they can give you inputs. And it's mandatory for the ethics committee to have initial training and continued training. Even you can think of some of the members themselves can take the role of, a short capsule or something every 6 months, discussing and then presenting, and then they can build capacity of each other. The types of review happen to be exempted and then expedited and full review. So exemption is mainly for those proposals which have less than minimal risk, or things like where there is a data which is available in public domain, or we have things like we are looking at quality control, quality assurance audits in the institution, instructional techniques and curricula variations or classroom management methods, or even sometimes we're looking at observation of public behavior when information is recorded without linking it to a particular person, so things like that. So these things can be under the ambit of exempted. Again, this is decided by the ethics committee, not by the researcher or the investigation team. I repeat that. So please, you have to put it up to the ethics committee. So next is expedited. So expedited comes for certain things again. That means it will be fast tracked. And this can be again a mechanism, or SOP in place, where this is first initially reviewed by the secretary or maybe one or two designated members, and then kind of provisionally accepted. Of course, it has to be ratified in the final full board meeting. So certain things can have an expedited review, like where you have a non-identifiable specimens, or you have clinical documentation material which are not identifiable, even MRD things. So again, this has to be brought to the ethics committee. Ethics committee decides whether it goes for that. And anything else which doesn't come under the first two has to go for a full board review. So full board review, everything else, I'll not go into details. So that's how it is. So this is how we go about. Now, please remember, ethics committee will always communicate its decision in writing. This has to be communicated in writing. It can be either approved without or with suggestions. It can be minor modifications or amendments which are suggested, so revision with minor modification, or it could be revision with major modification for resubmission. So in that case, you will place it again, full committee will reconsider. In minor modification, just the member secretary may look at and then, or not approved. So not approved means whatever was submitted is not acceptable. So please remember that we don't usually, ICMR doesn't recommend the term rejected to be used. It's rather not approved. So with that, I'll stop here. We've looked at some of the guidelines of ICMR. We've looked at the 12 principles. Some of the specific things like, benefit risk. We've also looked at things like responsible conduct of research, conflict of interest. We've also looked at the composition and functioning of ethics committee. So I will stop here. This was the small booklet that came out during COVID times. So this is again about 20-24 pages booklet, concise version. It's a nice one. So I'll stop here. I think I have some questions in the chat or comments in the chat I'll look at. In the meanwhile, Dr. Minija, you can tell me if there's something that I need to address.
Thank you, Dr. Animesh, for enlightening us on the ICMR guidelines and on the roles and responsibilities of ethics committee members, because everybody has a doubt, what's my role? What am I supposed to see when I get a protocol? I think I have a question for Dr. Surinder. This is regarding the drugs, because some of the drugs we say off-label. I think Dr. Pradeep also had the same question. For example, if a drug we are using for intravenous and we are using it for the eye for some reason, you had said that we have to take a central license authority or CLA. So do we have to do that before we use it for, or can we? I just wanted the clarification on that, sir. I think in the chat box, there's a question by Dr. Pradeep Sagar also. Even I too had the same question, because you had mentioned whenever using a drug, we have to get a CLA thing. So
Correct. See, if it is any drug that is approved, it will be approved for a particular indication, the type of formulation, the dosage strength, and the mode of dosage. Now, if you are moving from any deviation from any of these, like if you're using a new mode of, instead of, let's say IV, you are moving to a subcutaneous dosage. That is a new, you have to go to the DCGI and seek permission for that. So you cannot start anything. Or if you are going out of the indication, if you are using a different from a normal release to a sustained release, again, it's a change. So everything over and above what is already approved has to go to the DCGI before you start doing that.
So one more question I had, anybody can answer. This is regarding the consent, the ICF. Now for the global or regulatory trial, the consent forms are different. So for academic research, does the consent form vary? Because in the other form you have your impartial witness, your LAR. For academic research, does it differ the consent forms, or is it has to be same way like we do a regulatory trials in all vernacular language or anything like that, sir?
Well, okay. Okay, let me take it and maybe Dr. Animesh can join in. See, consent with whichever type of research we do, consent basic requirements will not change. If, say, when we are talking about regulatory trials or non-regulatory trials, consent remains fixed. Consent is not going to change. So the only difference that we have is because, we have to define two things. Patient information sheet, the information that is given, may be a lot which you get from regulatory trials because there's a lot of work that has happened on that. It gives a lot of information. For regular studies which are done in, let's say, in an academic setting, you may not have that much information because most of it is known. You might give a little information of what you are going to do and what the patient has to do. But the consent process does not change. It remains the same. If a patient is not able to sign, there will be an LAR. If an LAR is not able to join, you will have to have an impartial witness. So the categories are very well defined. It is no different for any type of trial. It will continue. Only for research things nowadays, now people are using electronic means. If you're doing certain surveys or anything, so you explain the process again, because a lot of times we say by putting in the click box mark X, and so consent is given. That is only an acceptance of what has been explained to the patient, the consent process. So that is what we have to kind of look at. So it is no different, and there are no different standards for consent. It is the same.
Yes, I agree, sir. You're right. See, in fact, ICMR gives you certain things that have to be mandatorily there for the consent. Okay, so whether it is academic research, yes, maybe you can say that, depending on what, as sir said, that, see, if you're doing a simple survey, so you have certain things which may not be as rigorous as when you're doing a regular trial. But the consent process in general, the principles remain the same, and that has to be there. I will just try and project something for you, and you can look at, see what ICMR expects the elements of.
The basic elements, absolutely.
Yes. So I was just trying to do that. So let me know if you can see this. Are you able to see this?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is from ICMR guidelines. So see on your left, that is elements of an ICD. All those 10 points are mandatory in any research. The right side is additional, optional. So it should be very explicitly saying statement that this is a research that they are getting into. Why? Because sometimes, see, if you are doing, say, Dr. Minija, your patient might think, or might get confused that is it a research or it's a part of the treatment that he or she is undergoing under you. Okay, so that. And what are the purpose, methods, duration, frequency? What are the benefits that you probably intend to give that participant? And not necessarily always monetary, it could be any other or mixed also. And what is the benefit that community may derive from this? And any kind of discomfort or risk, how are you going to maintain the confidentiality of these records? Is there any payment or reimbursement planned for participation? And then, if at all there is injury, how are you planning to deal with it? How are you going to compensate? And very explicitly, this should be always there, that they are free to participate or not to participate. That's their decision to choose to participate or not. And anytime, if it's a long ongoing thing, withdraw anytime without any adverse consequences. And then, very importantly, who are the people behind this? The contact person, the research team. So these are the important things. Then, of course, on the right, depending on case to case, we will have to look at these and then. So that's what exactly is the thing about.
Correct. Just to add on that, because the assumption typically is, oh, the major 10 elements I have put in, the rest are all optional, so I don't put it. So it's not like that. So whatever is applicable to your study, it has to be there. If you're taking biospecimens, you need to specify that as well.
Yes.
So it's not that, oh, I have put the major ones.
I think
yes, absolutely. Thank you, sir.
Dr. Kumar.
Dr. Maneja, just to go back to that question you had on the academic clinical trial where different indication. Dr. Kerr, there was an FAQ where DCGI confirmed that you might not require a CLA approval if it is not for commercial reasons, not for promotional reasons, but purely research.
Correct.
Ethics committee can give an
slide up. Yeah, I did put that slide up. You may not go for a permission if it is for academic purposes, but still you have to submit the protocol. That's an caveat that they give along with it. So which means by default, you still have to go to the DCGI anyway. So to be on the safer side, it's better, especially from an academic point of view, you submit it. It's better to do that.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. I think Dr. Kumaramanik will, sir, our chairperson, has some question.
Yeah, first of all, thanks to all of you. It was a wonderful program. It was very educative, nice program. So my question is that this happened to me in another institution practically. So there was a clinical trial, of course, in ophthalmology. And then what happened is that the trial was over and the patient came a year later saying that there is a problem in the eye. Now, at that state, who's responsible, whether the hospital or the clinical trial company? So we were confused at that point of time.
So I might share some of my experience as well, and this is a good example. Now, typically, if it is a study which has been done by, let's say, sponsored by any institution or any sponsor, so-called, there is an agreement that we agree. Now, 2 or 3 places in the protocol, you define up to what point in time in that research you are going to look at following up with the patient and getting any adverse events. Okay, so this might be as an adverse event. So that is one. So typically you try to define that upfront in the protocol. Second is in the contract process, you define upfront that, if there is, legal liability up to what point in time, typically because the moment the trial is over, there is a time period for which the patients can come back. So you typically define in that section of your clinical trial agreement. Now, having said that, now, if you go back, legal liability wise would be if there was the liability for this particular case, there would be no liability legally, either to the patient, either to the institution or to the investigator, because the study is over and that's what the coverage was. The insurance cover was till that time. Normally, even the insurance coverages are given beyond the time of the trial, over maybe 6 months beyond that. Typically, that's how it is covering this. But you need to report it to the sponsors anyway, if there is a sponsor in this study, from a reporting point of view. I had a study which was done in 90s. The patient came back 2 years after having a tumor in the breast, because this was known that this particular drug might do that. So we had defined it in upfront in the protocol that even after 2 years, because in some animal studies we had observed that. So you put it in that, define it upfront that what you expect, and certain unexpected things might come in, but you just have to report it back. But liability wise would be depending on what has been the liabilities defined upfront in the protocol or the contract. That's how it would be.
What we do as a company is we include a statement in all of our protocols that there is an AE reporting time, and after that time period, anytime in the follow-up, if the investigator thinks the event is related to the study drug, then that has to be reported. Because we add that right into the protocol, it will also be covered by our insurance.
Okay, thanks.
So I think Dr. Nizamuddin has a question.
I saw that. Yeah.
Record audio or video consent in a mobile on a regulatory trial.
Sir, would you like to?
Yeah, not on the mobile phone. I just read it. You can't take it on a mobile phone. It has to be done in a proper system, because mobile phones, there is no security, there is no confidentiality. So you are deviating from the confidentiality clause. So you can take the recording, but on a proper system, which is confidential, which is under lock and key kind of secured system, not on a mobile phone. Those are not acceptable.
So I will just show you some of these things that you asked for. Maybe I can probably show you that. Just give me a moment. So actually, there are certain guidelines which have to be followed. We can't just just do it like that, as you said. So it has to be done in a proper way. So any clinical trials, 2013 they said, but now it is like only for new drugs, 2015 amendment, and the vulnerable population. So we can do it for those, as well as you have to have a prior written consent even taken for AV recording.
AV recording.
I'm trying to just project that. Let me just see again.
Meanwhile, I think Dr. Mahesh has put in the chat box. Dr. Surinder, sir, can you just look into that and let us know if that is.
So I hope now you can see this. So see, these are some of the things. Now the videographer engaged as a part of the study team, or or you can have a fixed mounted camera, and there has to be confidentiality again ensured. So again, that's why mobile and all you can't. And then you have to have, as I said, prior consent for that. And you can also you'll have to have an identification of the participant or the subject or the LAR or the impartial witness as the your protocol demands, and there should be valid proofs of IDs. And when you're putting all these, so all the people who are authorized and present, only those who are supposed to be there, so they should be available and they should be included in frame. That frame should include and they should be seen in that. Okay, any people who are not related, they should not be seen in the frame. So these are some things that you have to look at, right?
Dr. Mahesh has put in the chat box.
I'm just saying the same. These are the FAQs which had come in, and this is all correct. There's nothing wrong in it. So where is the question here?
So
in which case, if you are using the drug for another route, why should we get the DCGI approval if it's a pre-existing
As long
drug?
as that's what I'm saying. As long as you are not using it for, if the drug is already you are not using it for commercial purposes, number one, which is correct, and you have followed all the 1, 2, and 3 points which are there.
Sir, am I trying to read in between lines? But is it you're talking about off-label use?
Yeah, that's what we are talking about. Off-label use is what we are talking about.
Yes.
That
okay.
might be from an indication point of view, but if we are changing the formulation,
okay,
which could be a new dosage form, then it may not be off-label. So label would be like the indications and all, typically what we mean by a label. But when we are talking about a different formulation altogether, that is what is also covered in this. You may not necessarily need to go to the the clinical, to the CLA, clinical the licensing authority.
Yeah, and also there's a huge burden on ethics committee to see and evaluate the safety of such a thing. So because Pradeep Sagar's command of streptokinase as an intravitreal injection. So to whether the committees have such an expertise to confirm such a use, and we'll have to evaluate all the preclinical data and any other clinical data. Even the FAQ gives that ethics committees can approach DCGI.
Correct. They will. So you can go to the DCGI and seek consent from DCGI and look at it.
I'm sorry, Dr. Minja, I'll have to leave now because I'm already in some other session at Manipal right now. So on site. So I am sorry, but I'll have to leave now. Kindly excuse me. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dr. Manish.
Dr. Pradeep, you want to ask anything? Your question is.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you all for the wonderful session. This was one issue we were facing because a few studies we had proposed to the ethical committee but could not get an approval. So because this is not used for this purpose earlier. For example, two things. One was about a use of triamcinolone, which is approved for various other purposes in the suprachoroidal route, but it was again not approved because this was approved by the ethical committee because it's not approved for use in the suprachoroidal space. That was one. And again, the other one was using streptokinase in the vitreous cavity, which is again not approved for this purpose, but this was purely an academic clinical trial. We're trying to evaluate whether this helps. That was the intention. So but both were not approved. So exactly so we are not able to understand what can be the way out. That's what the intention was. That's why I just posted that question.
If
I think Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Prasanna.
No, what I want to say is there are different things. So for example, something like using an atropine low dose on say myopia, which may not be approved in India, but if or now it's probably approved. That kind of things with very minor differences in the indication, but there is a safety already known in that route. Maybe ethics committee by going through all the data available in literature can take a decision or after consulting experts. But something like streptokinase directly going into intravitreal, there you would need a little more evidence. And at the same time, ethics committee itself might not be ready to take the complete liability, where they would recommend going to DCGI. So it will be case by case scenario based on what is the extent of change, what is the potential for risk, and what is the kind of data already available. So it is difficult to say that we would recommend all academic clinical trials to go into DCGI, but it may be case by case. Dr. K, sorry, please.
That's correct. No, because it's again depends on the risk that the ethics committee would like to take. Number one, depending on what kind of data has been submitted along with it. If they have rejected, they would have given a reason for that rejection or not approval or asked for more information. Because there again is that risks benefit assessment of what risks are being exposed by using that particular formulation or type. So it all is on a case-to-case basis, depending on what is required for that particular study, even if it is on an academic basis.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for the.
I think Dr. Sandeep, you have something to ask?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that when you're using or when you're applying for an academic trial, like when you want to use a tranexamic acid in this space, so what is the pharmacokinetics and what is the evidence that how the drug will behave? That is very important. If you submit this data along with it, then ethics committee might be in a fair frame of mind to look into that way. It is not simply an indication or just proposed benefit which could be by your observation when somebody accidentally administered it, or it could be some animal data, or could be some abstract of a study. But when you're proposing such an academic trial, it is just similar to what is a DCGI or approved clinical trial. You need to give PK data to support your whatever route of administration is this, because even when we are doing these animal studies, when we are approving the clinical trials, we are looking at the same route of administration and looking at what is happening to the animals. If you supplement your data with that, I don't think so ethics committee would have any problem in doing it. And as has already been mentioned by all the experts, it's always better to refer such trials to DCGI so that there is sharing of responsibility, because the expertise may not be there in the particular ethics committee, but DCGI definitely would be empowered or would having an access to those resource persons who would be better suited to this purpose, and then they would be definitely answering your question and maybe validating it in a much better way. Though these are novel things that you're both examples that you've been using streptokinase and this, but remember in the pursuit of research, we also need to look at what are the possible adverse things which could happen, and we have to balance out these, and we cannot just simply go by our idea, because obviously anybody who comes with the idea has a fair conviction, and obviously you must have thought pros and cons of that idea, and it nearly need to be accepted by the peers for it to go forward.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody has any questions? I know we have overshot the time for by half an hour. So if nobody has any questions, I would like to thank all the faculty members for enlightening us on this topic regarding ethics in clinical research. I know all of us are clinicians now, most of us are getting into research and clinical trials. So we should be aware of what's happening in the clinical trial, the new rules and regulations, our roles and responsibilities. And I'd also like to thank Dr. RVR, our founder of Shankarai Care Institution, joined us for the meeting, and all my colleagues, all my friends across all the units, all the IEC members of all the Shankarai units, the scientific committee members, and Tejaswini and Dr. Kaushik and Dr. Raju sir helping me in this webinar. Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.